Sometimes the softest stories are the ones the world forgets to tell. Tonight, I want you to know before anything else that you are loved here and you are safe. Every word that follows is a lantern meant to guide you gently inward, into that quiet place where memory and dream blur together. We'll walk through ancient echoes, whispers of gods that once shaped Ooo, and the tender footsteps of lives lived quietly under their watchful stars. But for now, I only ask you to rest, to let this tale carry you like a drifting boat across calm waters. We care deeply that you're here listening, letting your heart soften. Before we begin the story, tell me, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it there? Now take a sip of whatever comforts you, maybe tea, maybe coffee, and let's begin. Sometimes the softest stories are the ones the world forgets to tell. And before this one begins, I want you to know, you are safe here, you are cared for. Every word is meant to ease you into gentler breathing, into a space where your thoughts soften like mist over still waters. The dawn of Ooo was not filled with noise or fire. It was a dawn that arrived quietly, almost shyly, as though the sky itself was unsure it wanted to open. Long before kingdoms and crowns, before heroes carried swords, there were whispers in the dark. Some called them gods, though they were not gods in the way of thunder and lightning. They were softer. They hummed through stone, drifted through rivers, pressed their hands invisibly into the wind. People did not speak their names. Not out of fear, but reverence, like how one does not shout at the stars, but simply looks and lets them shine. The old ones were there in silence, a presence that brushed against the skin of the world like the wing of a moth in twilight. There was a child who came into being during this strange, tender dawn. No one remembered where he was born, or to whom. Some said he stepped quietly out of the forest one evening, carrying nothing but a piece of bread wrapped in cloth. Others whispered that he rose from the river itself, as though the water had decided it wanted to shape a boy and did. The truth was uncertain, but the feeling was real. This child did not belong entirely to the world, and yet he belonged to everyone. He had no name at first. The villagers who first found him said he carried a gaze that was steady, calm, and oddly knowing, as though the night sky had already told him its secrets. He grew up among ordinary people, farmers who baked bread in clay ovens, mothers who hummed lullabies as they washed clothes along the river stones, children who played with sticks and skipped over moss. Yet he was not entirely ordinary. He listened differently. When others heard only wind moving through trees, he tilted his head and smiled as though something whispered back to him. When the river rushed, he placed his hand in the current and spoke softly under his breath, not words anyone understood, but something closer to a hum. People said the river slowed for him, though perhaps that was only a trick of imagination. Still, it made others quiet in his presence, like stepping into a holy place. He was not loud, not quick, not dazzling. He was still. And in that stillness, people felt steadied. A mother once said her crying baby fell asleep when the child only looked at her, as though calmness itself had been shared like bread passed across a table. In those days, stories of gods were fading. The villagers remembered fragments, a tale of the stone weaver who set the first mountains in place, the cloud mother who sang rain into being, the lantern father who lit the stars one by one. But the names were slipping away, as old songs do when new ones take their place. And so the boy was, without knowing it, a vessel for memory. One evening, as the sky glowed faintly purple, the kind of purple that looks as though it was brushed on by an absent-minded painter, the boy sat at the edge of the river. He was no longer small, but not yet grown. His knees were tucked under his chin. The river carried leaves downstream, spinning slowly, fragile boats that would never return. He whispered, and this time someone heard. An old woman gathering reeds on the shore paused. She thought at first he was speaking to her, but the tone was too intimate, too inward. It was as though he spoke to the water itself. She listened. The boy said only one thing: "Thank you for carrying me." The old woman watched the river bend toward the horizon, and for a moment she too felt the hum of something larger. She did not tell anyone what she heard, because it felt like a secret too soft to share. But that night she slept without her usual dreams of worry, and she wondered if perhaps the gods were still present after all. The boy's life was not filled with grandeur. He grew by small degrees, like ivy on stone. He helped with fishing nets, though he often let the smallest fish slip back into the water. He tended fields. though he lingered more with the wildflowers than the wheat. Children teased him for his slow pace, his distracted gaze. But when storms came or when grief struck, they sought him out without realizing why. He never claimed wisdom. He never gave speeches. He simply was, and in his being others found quiet. As years passed, the villagers noticed something else. The boy did not age like the others. His hair grew longer, yes. His body stretched taller, but his face carried the same calm softness it had when he first appeared. He did not wrinkle, did not tire, did not dim. It was as though time treated him gently, skipping over him like a stone skipping over water. Whispers began. Some feared him, but most cherished him, for he was harmless and good. They wondered if he was one of the old gods in disguise, walking among them to remember what it meant to be human. Or perhaps he was simply a gift from them, a reminder that even in the ordinary rhythm of life the sacred still lingers. The boy never answered questions of who he was. He only listened, only smiled, only whispered to rivers and trees, and so the forgotten dawn passed into memory, though not entirely. For the people knew that they had witnessed something strange yet tender, something that hummed like a lullaby half remembered. They could not name it, but they felt it. The gods were not gone. They were only quieter now, and in the center of that quiet, a boy sat beneath the purple sky, with bread in his hands and starlight in his eyes, waiting for the world to remember. The first years of the boy's life unfolded like a dream half remembered at dawn. Fragments of laughter, moments of silence, a string of little wonders no one ever bothered to write down. And perhaps that is why the story still feels fragile, as though it could vanish if told too loudly. He was a child who belonged to the night as much as the day. While other children played loudly in the sunlight, chasing each other between crooked fences, his steps always carried him toward the darker edges of the fields. There, when evening came, he lay flat on the earth and stared upward as though the stars were speaking directly to him. The villagers would sometimes find him that way, eyes wide and unblinking, lips slightly parted as though mid-conversation. They would shake their heads and whisper, "Strange one," but always softly, never unkindly. There was something about him that made cruelty impossible. Even those who did not understand him could not bring themselves to wound him. At night, when families gathered around fires, he often slipped away. His feet made no sound in the grass. He carried no lantern, no torch. Instead, he trusted the silver wash of the moon to show him the way. And more often than not, he climbed the hill just beyond the village, the hill that sloped gently upward until it met a crown of dark oak trees. There, under that quiet canopy, he spoke. What he said was not always words. Sometimes it was humming. Sometimes it was only the rhythm of his breath. Sometimes it was the stillness itself, as though silence were his native tongue. But always, he tilted his face upward, and the stars seemed brighter when they looked back at him. No one knew exactly what he heard, but he listened deeply. And perhaps that was the gift. He made the stars feel less alone. One evening, while lying in the grass, he whispered something simple, "I see you." And though the night gave no answer, he smiled. The boy did not grow in the usual way. His childhood stretched long, unhurried, as though time itself respected his stillness. The children who had once run beside him became taller, older, heavier with worry. They began to carry baskets of grain, to mend nets, to court and wed. Yet he remained light, almost weightless, his laughter unchanged, his curiosity undimmed. A girl who had once been his playmate grew into a young mother. She often passed him with her child resting heavy on her hip. Once, when her baby would not stop crying, she paused near the hill where he sat watching the stars. He reached out one gentle hand, touched the baby's tiny fist, and without a word the child stilled, drifting into sleep. The mother's eyes filled with something she could not name. Gratitude, yes, but also awe, as though she had brushed against something holy. She wanted to ask him how he did it, but she knew no answer would come. So she simply whispered, "Thank you," and carried her child away. The boy never sought thanks. He never sought anything. He only lived as though each moment was a secret worth holding tenderly. He did have quirks, of course. He would take bread from the oven not to eat, but to carry with him up the hill, offering it to the night sky. He often fell asleep in the grass, his arms stretched wide as though embracing the stars. He collected feathers, smooth stones, and empty snail shells, not hoarding them, but arranging them in circles, patterns only he seemed to understand. Sometimes children mocked him for these habits. They called him Dream Eater, Star Boy, names meant to sting. But when they laughed in his presence, their laughter softened. Somehow the sharpness dulled, and soon they were only giggling without malice, as though his very being smoothed their cruelty into play. One elder in the village began to notice. He was a man with a long beard, bent back and eyes clouded with age. He had seen many children grow, many seasons turn, many graves dug. Yet the boy unsettled him, not with fear but with recognition. One night the elder climbed the hill himself and found the boy already lying there. "What do you see?" the old man asked. His voice was gravelly, worn thin with years. The boy blinked slowly, as though surfacing from a deep pool of thought. "I see lights," he answered softly. "Not just the stars, I see someone watching back." The elder felt a chill, not unpleasant but deep. He lowered himself to the grass with effort and stared up alongside the boy. "And what do they say to you, these watchers?" The boy was quiet for a long while. Then he turned his face toward the elder, eyes shining in the moonlight. "They tell me not to hurry." The old man chuckled faintly, though his chest tightened. Not to hurry, what wisdom, what impossible command. His life had been a rush of planting, harvesting, marrying, burying. Always moving, always striving. And here was this child, calm as stone, telling him the stars themselves whispered patience. From that night on, the elder visited often. He brought no gifts, no questions, only presence. The two would lie side by side beneath the night sky, sometimes speaking, sometimes silent. And in that silence the elder found more rest than he had in decades. The boy grew slowly, gently. He began to resemble not just a child, but something in between, a figure suspended between worlds. His hair grew long, his eyes softened further, and his hands became steady and graceful. He wove reed baskets, not for use, but for beauty. He sang songs no one had taught him, and always, always he returned to the stars, for he believed, though he never said aloud, that he had come from them. Not fallen like a meteor, not descended like fire, but drifted quietly like starlight itself, settling into human form. And when he looked up each night, he did not feel longing, only recognition. The villagers learned to leave him be, though they held him dear. They brought him bread, invited him to their gatherings, and cared for him as though he were both child and elder, both mystery and kin. He belonged and yet remained apart, like the stars themselves, above but never out of reach. In time, he began to hear more than just whispers in the wind. He began to feel presence in dreams. At night, he would close his eyes and drift into visions where shapes too large for words lingered at the edges of his sight. A hand of stone brushing mountains smooth, a voice like a river singing, a lantern swinging in darkness, scattering sparks across the sky. When he woke, he remembered little, only the feeling that he was not alone, and never had been. And though he was still only a child, strange, slow, luminous, he carried that secret within him like a flame cupped in his palms. The child beneath the stars was not ordinary. He was a reminder, a quiet echo of the old gods who had not left, but only softened, waiting to be remembered through him. And so the nights of his youth stretched on, tender and dreamlike, until the day arrived when childhood began to give way to something more, something like purpose. There comes a moment in every childhood when something shifts, when the ordinary world reveals a seam, a soft crack, and something beyond it shines through. For most, that seam appears in small ways. A sudden kindness from a stranger, a word that lingers longer than expected, a glimpse of beauty so sharp it feels almost painful. For him, it came in the form of a gift. The boy did not think of it as a gift at first. It was simply something that happened, like rain falling or bread rising in an oven. But it marked him quietly, like a thread woven into the fabric of his being that would never come loose. It began one morning near the river. He was older now, tall but still youthful, moving with the unhurried rhythm that defined him. The village had gathered along the bank to wash clothes, mend nets, and exchange stories. The river glimmered with light, restless and alive, as though it too had joined the gathering. A child younger than him, barely past toddler years, wandered too close to the water. One slip of a foot, one loose stone, and the river took hold. Cries erupted as the little one tumbled forward into the current, swept too quickly for small arms to resist. The villagers panicked. Some shouted. Others reached helplessly toward the rushing water. But before anyone could leap in, The boy was already moving. He did not run. He did not leap. He simply stepped into the water with the calmness of someone entering a doorway he had walked through many times before. His clothes grew heavy, the current tugged, but his body remained steady. He reached out one hand, fingers open like petals, and the river seemed to still just enough. The child floated toward him, as though carried by an unseen hand. The boy gathered him close, pressed his face gently against his shoulder, and walked back to shore with the river parting quietly around his legs. When they emerged, the villagers stared. The rescued child coughed once, then fell asleep against the boy's chest, safe. Not a scratch, not a bruise. No one spoke for a long while. The river, usually noisy and quick, sounded hushed, reverent. Then at last, the old woman who had once overheard him speaking to the water whispered, "He asked it. He asked the river to let go." The boy lowered his gaze. He did not confirm nor deny. He only placed the sleeping child back into the mother's arms and stepped aside as though nothing unusual had happened. But something had happened. Something that could not be forgotten. From that day on, the villagers saw him differently. He was no longer only the strange child who whispered to stars and rivers. He was someone touched by powers that did not belong to men alone. The boy himself did not think of it as power. To him, it was only listening. He had spoken softly within himself to the rushing water, and the river had answered. It had not been control or command. It had been agreement. A gift returned for a gift given long ago. That night, lying once more on his familiar hill beneath the stars, he whispered, "Why me?" The stars gave no answer, but he felt warmth spread across his chest, a quiet reassurance that it was not a mistake. The gift had chosen him because he had been listening all along. Over time, small signs followed. A sickly flower in the field straightened after he lingered near it, humming softly. A bird with a broken wing calmed in his hands, healed enough to fly away the next day. None of it was dramatic, none of it announced with fire or spectacle. It was subtle, slow, tender, like the boy himself. The villagers brought him small troubles. A cracked jug, a restless baby, a crop that refused to ripen. He never promised results, but he listened. And sometimes things softened, sometimes things grew, sometimes calm settled where there had been none before, and always. When he finished, he walked away quietly, almost shyly, as though embarrassed by the attention. The elder, who had once lain beside him under the stars, approached him one evening after seeing these small wonders. His voice trembled, not with fear but with awe. "You carry something of the old ones," the elder said. "Something most of us have forgotten how to touch." The boy shook his head gently. "I carry nothing. I only listen." But the elder smiled, eyes glistening. "Listening is the gift. That is what we lost." The boy pondered those words for many nights. Listening as gift, it was not strength, not conquest, not command. It was openness, receptivity, the willingness to be touched by the world. And perhaps that was what the gods themselves had always wanted. Someone to hear them, even as they grew quieter, even as memory of them faded. One evening, the boy wandered to the river alone. He knelt at the water's edge and let his reflection ripple. He dipped both hands into the current and whispered, "Thank you." The water shimmered. It did not speak, not in words, but in the way it brushed gently against his skin, cool and alive. In that moment, he knew the truth of the first gift. It was not something given to him to keep. It was something shared, exchanged, a bond rather than a possession, and so he resolved to carry it carefully. Never to boast, never to use it for gain, only to listen, only to soften, only to remind others that gentleness itself is a kind of power. The villagers continued their lives. Seasons passed, fields tilled, harvests gathered, children born. Yet all the while they knew something had changed. The boy among them was not just theirs. He was a bridge between earth and water, between sky and stars, between gods remembered and gods forgotten. And though he himself never claimed such a title, they began to whisper it anyway under their breath. As one whispers a prayer, the listener. The name followed him softly, like a shadow, like a song hummed at the edge of sleep. The river had always been a companion to the boy, even before the day it answered him, even before the villagers whispered about his gift. He had felt its steady pulse as though it were a second heartbeat in his chest. Some evenings, When the village had quieted and smoke curled upward from chimneys in soft blue ribbons, he would walk alone to the water's edge. He would sit with knees drawn close, listening not for words, but for patterns, the way the current shifted over stone, the rhythm of droplets falling from willow branches, the faint echo of fish darting through the shallows. To most it was only noise. To him it was language, and in those sounds he heard something more. Memory. The river carried more than water. It carried stories. Each ripple held the faintest echo of what it had once touched, the mountain snowmelt that birthed it, the forests it passed through, the tears of mothers, the laughter of children. All of it blended, reshaped, whispered onward. One night he lay back on the grass beside the current and closed his eyes. He allowed the rushing sound to fill him until it blurred the edges of thought. And as he drifted into that space between waking and dream, the memories of the river slipped into him. He saw flashes, hands long gone, cupped to drink. A child from another time dropping a carved toy boat, which sailed for only a moment before sinking. Lovers who had met secretly on the banks, pressing their foreheads together as fireflies rose. A hunter who once dipped his arrows in the water as though it would bless his aim. They were not his memories, and yet they moved through him as though they belonged to his bones. When he opened his eyes, the stars above looked different, closer, brighter, as though they too were listening. He whispered softly, "I will remember for you." From that day on, he carried the river's echoes with him. He would be walking through the village and suddenly pause, struck by the sensation of someone else's laughter in his chest. Or he would sit with a child and recall, without knowing how, the shape of lullabies sung generations before. The river had entrusted him with fragments, and though they were not his, he treated them as sacred. The villagers began to notice. He would speak gently to them, recalling details they had not told him. A grandmother's favorite flower, a father's habit of humming while repairing nets, a story half forgotten from their childhoods. He offered these things not as revelations, but as small gifts returned, reminders that they, too, were part of something larger. One woman wept when he described the scent of bread her mother once baked, though he had never met the mother, nor entered her home. The boy only smiled and said, "The river remembers, and so do I." It was then that the villagers began to treat the river differently. They no longer cursed it when floods came. They no longer took its fish greedily. They learned to leave offerings, small flowers, bits of bread, whispered thanks. The boy had reminded them that the river was not simply water. It was a being with memory, and memory deserved reverence. Still, the boy was not untouched by sorrow. Carrying echoes meant carrying grief, too. The river did not filter what it remembered. It carried loss as easily as joy. One night, the boy dreamt of a mother crying over an empty cradle. Another night, he felt the despair of a man who had thrown himself into the current and never risen again. At first, these memories unsettled him. They clung to him like shadows, heavy and wet. But as the seasons passed, he began to understand. Sorrow was also part of the gift. To listen fully meant to hear everything, not only laughter but also tears. And he discovered something else. By carrying sorrow, he could lighten it. Villagers who had suffered would sometimes sit beside him without speaking, and slowly, their grief seemed to soften. Not vanish, not disappear, but loosen enough for them to breathe again. It was as though the boy absorbed the heaviness, sharing it with the river so no one person had to hold it alone. The elder noticed this change. One evening he joined the boy by the water, his old eyes reflecting starlight. "You carry more now," the elder said gently. The boy nodded. "The river gives me its burdens. And do you want them?" The boy thought for a long while. At last he whispered, "They are not mine, but they are not heavy when I remember they belong to all of us. The river reminds me of that." The elder sighed, a deep and weary sound, but he smiled faintly. "Then perhaps you are stronger than any of us ever knew." But the boy did not feel strong. He only felt open and sometimes tired. Yet in that tiredness there was peace, the way a field rests after harvest, empty but not wasted. Seasons passed. Leaves turned gold and fell into the river, carried away like thoughts dissolving into sleep. Snow blanketed the banks in silence. Spring returned, filling the current with rushing thaw. And always the boy was there, listening, remembering, sharing. Children began to follow him sometimes, curious. He did not shoo them away. He showed them how to place their ears close to the water, how to listen not for words but for feelings. Some laughed at the attempt. Others grew quiet, sensing something they could not name. One little girl, no more than 7, said, "It feels like the river is humming." The boy smiled. Yes, that is how it speaks when it is content. The girl carried that memory with her all her life, passing it down to her children, who passed it to theirs. And so the river's song was not forgotten. In time, the boy came to understand that his first gift, the ability to listen, was not meant for him alone. It was meant to ripple outward, teaching others that the world itself was alive with memory, and that to live well was to live in conversation with it. And though he could not name the gods of old, though their forms were still hidden, he sensed them here most clearly in the river's endless voice, not thundering, not commanding, but echoing, soft, patient, eternal. One evening, as dusk bled into night, he whispered into the water, "You will not be forgotten." The current brushed his hands in reply, carrying the promise onward, down into valleys, through forests, toward oceans where other listeners might someday hear. And so the boy sat, not only with the stars above him, but with echoes beneath him, weaving him into a story larger than himself. A story of memory, grief, and gratitude flowing endlessly forward, like the river itself. The village oven was the heart of their gatherings. It was not only a place where dough rose and baked into loaves, but where stories and laughter thickened in the smoke. Women hummed as they kneaded, men traded quiet jokes as they stacked wood. Children peeked in wide-eyed at the golden light spilling from the open mouth of fire. The boy, no longer so small, though still called child by those older than him, began to spend more time there. He liked the rhythm of baking, the press of palms into soft dough, the way flour drifted like pale snow across wooden tables, the warmth that wrapped him as he leaned against stone walls. But what drew him most was something others could not see. For in the rising of bread, he sensed another language, quiet, patient, alive. Each loaf seemed to carry whispers of the grain fields, the winds that had bent them, the rain that had fed their stalks. When the dough swelled under cloth, he felt it was not simply yeast at work, but memory unfolding, a small echo of earth transformed into nourishment. One evening, as the oven glowed and the stars blinked awake above the rooftops, he lingered near the baker's. The air was thick with the scent of bread crust browning. He reached out, brushing his fingers lightly against a loaf set to cool. In that touch, warmth spread not only through his hand but through his chest. Images came, farmers bent over fields, laughter at harvest, calloused hands scattering seed. The bread carried not only the labor, but the hope of all who had made it possible. It was starlight grounded, the cosmos folded into something simple enough to break and share. He closed his eyes, smiling. "This," he whispered, "is the taste of prayer." The elder standing nearby overheard. He placed a wrinkled hand on the boy's shoulder. "And what does the prayer say?" The boy thought carefully, then answered, "It says we are never hungry alone. It says the earth remembers us." The elder's eyes softened, but he did not speak. Some truths were best left to linger in silence. As seasons turned, the boy began to help more often. At first he fetched water or gathered kindling. Later he was trusted to knead, his hands pressing rhythm into dough. He learned that patience was as important as strength, that dough resisted if rushed, but yielded if handled with care. And always, as he worked, he listened, not only to the crackle of the oven, but to the way the bread seemed to hum softly as it baked, a music no one else could hear. At times, when loaves were broken and shared in the village square, he caught glimpses in people's eyes, an easing of sorrow, a flicker of joy, as though the bread itself carried more than sustenance. It carried memory and light, made edible. The villagers, without realizing it, began to call these loaves the boy's bread, even when others baked them. Something in the air had changed since he began to listen. But bread was not only for joy. It was also for grief. One winter, harsh and unforgiving, sickness swept through the village. Fires burned low, doors remained shut, and the oven stood quiet more days than full. The boy, now tall enough to lift heavy baskets, helped deliver what bread they could spare to households in mourning. He walked alone in snow, carrying warm loaves wrapped in cloth. When he entered silent homes, the smell of bread filled rooms where laughter had fled. And sometimes, he swore, the loaves pulsed faintly in his hands as though offering comfort beyond warmth. One mother, pale from loss, took a loaf from him and wept openly as she pressed it to her face. "It smells like the days before," she whispered. "It smells like my children laughing." The boy said nothing. He only bowed his head, leaving the loaf with her. Bread could not cure grief, but it could remind the heart of life still near. Yet joy returned as it always did when spring softened the earth. On festival nights, the oven blazed bright. Loaves were lined like stars across long tables, and villagers danced barefoot beneath the moon. The boy joined them, hesitant at first, then freely, his laughter echoing with theirs. During one such festival, he lifted a loaf high, its crust shining in firelight. He broke it in half and gave a piece to the little girl, who had once said the river hummed. She bit into it, crumbs clinging to her lips, and whispered, "It tastes like starlight." The boy smiled. "That is because the stars are in everything we make." Her eyes widened, as though this were the greatest secret she had ever heard. She carried the truth with her like a treasure. The elder, watching from the edge of the square, later approached the boy. "Do you see, child? The gods of old may not walk among us, but through bread and river and sky they still teach. And you—" his voice trembled. "You are the reminder." The boy lowered his gaze. He had never thought of himself as holy, only listening. Yet deep inside he felt what the elder meant. His gift was not only for him. It was for the weaving of the village, for keeping memory alive in the simplest of things. And so he learned, bread was more than food. It was a vessel of belonging, a piece of earth and sky shared from hand to hand. It was gratitude made visible. As the night deepened and stars multiplied overhead, the boy sat quietly with half a loaf beside him. He tore off a small piece, lifted it toward the sky, and whispered into the darkness, "To the ones who came before, to the ones who will come after, may none of us ever be forgotten." The bread, warm in his palm, seemed to answer. Or perhaps it was only his heart, fuller than ever, rising like dough in the quiet oven of the night. And in that moment, the boy knew every gift he carried, the echoes of river, the whispers of stars, the warmth of bread, was not his to keep. They were meant to be broken, shared, passed forward, like bread, like starlight, like memory itself. The boy was growing, taller in the shoulders, steadier in the gaze, but there were questions within him that bread and rivers alone could not answer. Questions about why the stars whispered, why memories clung to the simplest things, why sometimes silence carried more weight than words. And it was then that the mentor appeared, not with ceremony, not with noise. He was an old man, bent in the back, slow in the step. Some said he had been a traveler once, wandering far past the edges of the known hills. Others said he had always been there, a fixture in the village like stone or wind, too easily overlooked until one looked closer. His name was seldom spoken. Most simply called him the listener. The boy first noticed him by the river, seated on a flat stone watching water slide past. He was not fishing. He was not working. He only sat there, hands folded loosely in his lap, head tilted slightly as though hearing something others could not. The boy approached cautiously. "What are you listening to?" The old man smiled without moving his eyes from the current. "The river tells many things. Not all are meant for me, but some are." The boy sat beside him, feeling awkward at first, his feet dangling just above the water. Together they stayed in silence until the boy could bear it no longer. What did it say today? The old man finally turned, his eyes soft but piercing. "That you, child, have already been listening longer than most ever will." The boy's cheeks flushed. He looked down, unsure whether to deny or accept the words. The river's song trickled between them, filling the space where answers were not needed. Days became weeks, and the boy found himself drawn back to the listener. Sometimes the old man sat in the orchard, tracing circles in the dirt with a stick. Sometimes he tended to the smallest of plants along the path, ferns no one else noticed, moss that most would step on without thought. And sometimes he simply leaned against a tree, as though the bark itself spoke to him. The boy began to join him, not always with questions, but with presence. And slowly the old man began to teach. His lessons were not like the elder's stories or the baker's instructions. He did not explain directly. Instead, he offered fragments, small and simple, as though each word were a pebble dropped into still water. One evening, as stars pressed against the velvet sky, the boy asked, "How do I know if what I hear is true?" The old man replied, "Truth hums the same way in your chest as bread smells when it is ready. It rises without you forcing it. If you must strain to believe, perhaps it is not truth." Another day, the boy wondered aloud, why do people forget what the gods once said? The mentor answered, "Forgetting is not failure. Forgetting is a kindness too. Imagine if the river carried every fallen leaf forever. There would be no room for new ones to drift." And once when the boy confessed, "Sometimes I feel heavy, carrying what I hear, as though I am strange among them." The old man placed a gentle hand on his shoulder and whispered, "You are not strange, child. You are tuned. A flute may feel out of place among stones, but without it how would the air ever sing?" The boy absorbed these fragments like thirsty soil. They did not all make sense at once, but each rested in him, waiting like seeds that would sprout in time. What he valued most was not the words themselves, but the way the old man carried silence. In his presence, silence did not feel empty. It felt alive, generous. The boy realized that listening was more than waiting for sound. Listening was a way of loving the world. There were small rituals the mentor taught, though he never called them rituals. "Sit with the dawn before speaking," he advised one morning. "Let the day introduce itself before you interrupt. Thank the soil when you pick its fruit," he reminded as they walked through fields. "You are not taking, you are receiving." And once when they shared bread, the old man broke his half into smaller pieces, scattering them on the earth. Birds landed, pecking gratefully. "Always leave room for others at the table, even those without words." The boy nodded, imprinting each gesture deep in his memory. The villagers noticed the bond. Some teased gently, saying the boy had found a second grandfather. Others shook their heads, whispering that too much silence would make him odd. But the boy didn't mind. There was a strength in walking with someone who understood the weight of quiet things. One day the old man spoke of journeys. "I have walked beyond these hills, across lands where the sky looks unfamiliar, and the rivers speak in accents you do not yet know. But in every place I found one truth. The world is softer than people think. It bends toward kindness if you lean with it." The boy asked, "Will I walk those lands too?" The mentor closed his eyes, breathing slowly. "Perhaps. But even if your feet never leave this soil, your listening will travel farther than mine ever did." Their last meeting was not marked as such. Neither knew it was the final lesson. The old man sat again by the river, weaker now, his breath thin but steady. The boy, nearly grown, sat beside him as always. They did not speak for a long while. Finally, the mentor whispered, "Do you hear it?" The boy tilted his head. The river sounded the same as always, soft currents, pebbles shifting, branches dipping. "I hear," he said quietly. The old man nodded, closing his eyes. "Then my work is done." A few days later, the listener was gone, carried away not by storm or sickness, but by the gentle drift of time. The village mourned, yet softly. He had lived as he had taught, without noise, without grand endings, only a fading into the hush of memory. The boy, now with shoulders broad enough to carry grief, returned to the river alone. He sat on the stone where the old man had once rested. He folded his hands in his lap, tilted his head and listened. The water whispered not with answers but with presence, and in the boy's chest, truth rose like bread in an oven. He realized the mentor was still here, not gone, woven into the current, into the silence, into every breath of listening he would ever take. That night, as he lay under the stars, the boy repeated the old man's words. "A flute may feel out of place among stones, but without it how would the air ever sing?" And as sleep pulled him into its embrace, he dreamt of flutes carved from rivers, of bread that glowed with starlight, of silence that spoke in 1,000 voices. The quiet mentor had left no monuments, no scrolls, no records, but his legacy lived, pulsing softly in the boy's heart, a gift not of answers but of listening. Power in the boy's mind had always been something loud. It was fire leaping from logs, storms tearing across fields, mountains standing unmovable. Power was noise, size, weight. At least, that is what he thought when he was younger. But as the seasons deepened and he grew, he began to notice a different kind of strength, quieter, subtler, yet no less real. It was not in what he could command, but in what he could yield. It began with his hands. One afternoon, as he helped repair a roof after heavy rain, he felt the wooden beams beneath his palms give a soft hum, as if they remembered every storm they had endured. His fingers tingled, and for a moment the sagging timber straightened, not through force but through something gentler. It was as though the wood trusted him, leaning into his touch. The villagers praised his steady work, but he knew there was more than muscle in it. Something invisible passed through him, an attunement, a quiet power that bent toward restoration. Another time, while comforting a child who had scraped her knee, he placed his palm lightly against her skin. He whispered, "It will be all right," not expecting much. But beneath his touch, her sobs quieted faster than usual. A warmth spread, not fiery but calm, like a blanket being tucked around her. She looked up at him with wide eyes. "You make the hurt softer," she said. The words stayed with him. He was not healing in the way stories told of great heroes or gods. He was softening what was sharp, easing what was heavy. That was his gift. The powers grew not by intention, but by noticing. He learned that when he listened deeply, not only to people but to trees, rivers, and bread, the world seemed to lean closer, as though eager to share its burdens. His presence became a balm. Disputes in the village eased when he spoke quietly, his words carrying the weight of listening more than authority. Even animals responded. A restless ox once calmed under his hand, lowering its head until its breath matched his. Birds sometimes landed near him without fear, pecking at the ground as though he were part of the earth itself. The villagers began to seek him in subtle ways, not as a leader, but as a presence. Mothers asked him to sit with anxious children. Farmers welcomed him to walk their fields before planting. The old baker insisted he rest a hand on each batch of dough, claiming the loaves stayed fresher longer when he did. He never called it power. To him it felt more like listening outward, the same way he had listened to the river with the mentor. It was not about bending the world. It was about letting the world bend through him. But power, even soft, can carry weight. One evening during a summer festival, a dispute broke out between two families over land boundaries. Voices rose sharp and jagged in the cool air. The boy, now nearly grown, felt the tension ripple through the crowd. Without thinking, he stepped between them. He did not shout. He only raised his hands and breathed slowly. The crowd seemed to follow, their voices dropping. He spoke quietly, words simple as bread. "The land is older than us all. It will remain when we are gone. Tonight, let us eat together. Tomorrow we can walk the boundary with gentler eyes." It should not have been enough, and yet silence spread like dew, cooling the heat of anger. One of the men lowered his gaze. The other exhaled. The crowd softened. That night people whispered, "He carries the old gods in him." The boy lay awake afterward, troubled. He had not meant to wield power, only to calm. Yet he felt the weight of expectation pressing closer, like a cloak too heavy for his shoulders. The quiet mentor's words returned to him. "A flute may feel out of place among stones, but without it, how would the air ever sing?" Perhaps he thought these gifts were not his alone. They were meant to pass through him into the world, like songs carried by wind. Still, he feared what others might demand of him if they mistook gentleness for miracle. So he resolved to hold his powers like one holds a fragile cup, with care. Never too tightly, never flaunted. Seasons folded into one another. His powers grew more refined, though always in silence. He could ease nightmares simply by sitting near the restless sleeper, humming softly until their breaths aligned with his. He could mend broken tools more swiftly, as though the wood and metal welcomed repair under his hands. He could even sense when storms approached, not by watching the sky but by feeling a tremor in the earth, a shiver in the wind. Yet he kept these things quiet, shared only in small acts. He never sought to be called healer or prophet. To him it was enough that bread rose better, that children slept easier, that disputes ended with less sorrow. One evening, as twilight stretched violet across the sky, the girl who once said bread tasted of starlight sat beside him. She was older now, too, her laughter softer, her eyes deeper. "Do you know what you do to people?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "I only listen." She shook her head. "No, you remind us of who we are when we forget. That is your power." The words struck him gently but firmly. Power was not what flowed through him. It was what awakened in others when they felt seen, heard, softened. He looked at her, then at the stars blinking into the night. "Then perhaps," he whispered, "the gods have never left. They simply live in our remembering." She nodded, taking his hand. They sat in silence, not needing more. That night, as he drifted towards sleep, the boy, no longer quite a boy, dreamed of the mentor, seated by the river. The old man spoke only one phrase: "Do not be afraid of your gentleness. It is the strongest thing you carry." And when he awoke, the dream lingered, pulsing like quiet starlight in his chest. He rose, knowing his path was not one of loud miracles, but of soft powers, powers that wove comfort, steadiness, and memory into the world, powers that bent not through force but through presence, and he carried them lightly. Like bread warm from the oven, meant always to be shared, never to be hoarded. Wind had always been a companion in Ooo. It rattled shutters in winter, carried pollen in spring, rustled the leaves of summer orchards, and sighed low through autumn's bare branches. But to him the wind was not just weather. It was a voice. At first it came as whispers, indistinct, like someone speaking through the folds of a dream. When he walked the hills at dusk, he sometimes paused, tilting his head as if someone had called his name. The grass bent, the air stirred, and something passed through him, not words, but music too soft to be fully caught. The villagers often teased about wind spirits and old tales, yet none seemed to hear what he did. He wondered if this too was part of the soft powers blooming quietly within him. One evening, while carrying firewood home, he stopped on the ridge where the land dropped into valley. The air shifted, warm against one cheek, cool against the other. He set the wood down, closed his eyes and listened, and there it was, a melody. Not like a song sung by voices, but something woven from breath itself. Rising, falling, carrying notes too ancient to name. He stood, heart trembling, as the melody curved around him like invisible arms. It was not loud, not insistent. It was patient, tender, vast. The wind sang of journeys, clouds drifting across endless sky, seeds carried from one land to another, ships once guided by unseen currents. It sang of sorrow too, trees bent in storms, roofs lifted, fields stripped bare. But even in its sorrow there was rhythm, a reminder that destruction and creation were threads of the same cloth. He whispered into the gust, unsure if anyone, or anything, listened. Why me? The wind only shifted, carrying the scent of rain from far away. From that day he began to hear songs more often. When he walked alone, the air seemed to follow. When he worked, breezes slipped into rhythm with his movements, as though encouraging his hands. Even at night, when windows creaked and curtains fluttered, he sometimes woke not in fear but in wonder, believing the wind was calling to him. The villagers noticed, though they did not understand. He's always staring at nothing, one said, always listening where there is no sound, but a few, especially children, grew curious. They asked him to tell what the wind said. He never gave the same answer twice. Today it said the trees are laughing. Today it hummed of storms 3 valleys away. Today it reminded me that we are as light as seeds, meant to travel, meant to rest. Some believed him. Some only laughed. Yet the children always returned, eager to hear more. One day, while sitting beneath the great oak at the edge of the village, he hummed along with a breeze. A little girl stopped, tilting her head. "You know the tune," she said. He looked at her, startled. "You hear it too?" "Not the same way," she admitted. "But when you hum, it feels like I almost can." Something softened in him. Perhaps he was not alone after all. He began to hum more often, letting the wind shape the notes. The melodies were simple, sometimes little more than a rise and fall, like a lullaby. But villagers started to notice. At festivals, his quiet humming drifted through crowds, calming quarrels, softening grief. Children slept easier when he sang. Bread seemed to rise lighter when he worked near the ovens with a tune on his lips. The wind had given him a gift, the gift of carrying its song into human hearts. Yet not all songs were gentle. One night, a storm swept down from the mountains. Winds howled, rattling doors, snapping branches, tearing roofs. Villagers huddled indoors, fearful. He stood at his window, heart pounding, not from fear but from recognition. This was the same voice he had come to love, but wild, untamed, furious. He pressed his palms against the wood, whispering, "I am here. I am listening." For a moment the wind seemed to pause. The howling shifted into a long, low sigh. And though the storm raged on, he felt within it not cruelty, but a desperate need to be heard. The next morning, when the sun broke through clouds, the village emerged to survey the damage. It was less than expected. Roofs bent but not shattered, trees bowed but not uprooted. People shook their heads, murmuring, "The storm was kind." He knew otherwise. The storm had not been kind. It had been acknowledged. Sometimes even fury softens when met with listening. Over time, he began to weave the wind's songs into daily life. He taught children to close their eyes and hum with the breeze, letting it lift their hair and spirits. He showed farmers how to watch the way wind bent grasses, predicting weather before clouds appeared. He even stood by grieving families, letting his soft humming carry comfort like unseen arms. The villagers no longer laughed. Some began to call him the Wind Keeper. Others simply said, "When he listens, the air itself grows lighter." He never claimed titles. He only knew this: the wind had trusted him with its voice, and it was his duty to carry that trust gently. One evening, as dusk deepened into indigo, he sat again on the ridge where it all began. The valley stretched below, rivers gleaming faintly like silver threads. The wind rose, soft and cool, brushing his cheeks. He hummed a tune the wind had taught him long ago, and to his wonder the breeze answered, lifting the notes, scattering them outward, carrying them farther than his voice alone could reach. He imagined the song drifting across fields, slipping into open windows, stirring the dreams of those who listened without knowing why their hearts felt soothed. The girl who once tasted starlight joined him, sitting close. "It feels like the whole world is breathing with you," she said softly. He smiled, eyes on the horizon. "Not with me, with us, always with us." Together they sat, humming with the night, carried by the endless breath of wind that had sung since before memory and would sing long after. That night, as he lay down to rest, he thought of the songs that had guided him, from bread to river, from mentor to stars. Each gift had been gentle, soft, quiet, and yet they shaped not only his life, but the life of all who touched his presence. As sleep took him, the last thing he heard was a breeze brushing against the walls, humming like a lullaby meant only for him, and in his dream, he walked across fields of grass taller than himself, each blade bending as the wind sang through them. The melody was endless, tender, eternal. He woke with the certainty that he was not only listening anymore, he was part of the song. Mountains are often seen as guardians, tall, immovable, ancient. Yet there was one in the distance that was not like the others. Villagers called it the Lonely Mountain. It stood apart from its kin, a single dark mass rising from the plains, its peak often veiled in cloud. Children whispered that no birds flew above it, no streams ran down its sides. They said that those who climbed it never returned, or if they did, they came back changed, eyes distant, words slower, as though they had left something behind upon its slopes. He had heard the stories all his life, but the pull of the Lonely Mountain grew stronger as he aged. It was not a reckless call, not a lure of danger. It was quieter, steadier, like a patient hand resting on his shoulder. One morning, when the wind carried a song that bent toward the east, he knew it was time. The journey began with fields that gave way to rolling hills. Villagers watched him go, some shaking their heads, some whispering prayers. A few children waved, believing he was walking into a story. He waved back, though his heart carried the weight of uncertainty. For days he walked. The mountain loomed larger, its solitude pressing against him even from afar. At night he camped beneath trees and listened to the wind. But as he drew closer, the songs grew fainter as though the air itself held its breath. On the fourth day, the fields ended. Rock and scrub took their place, barren and unwelcoming. The path upward was steep, more a scar carved by centuries of storms than a trail meant for feet. He began to climb. The lower slopes were silent except for the scrape of his boots. No birds sang. No insects stirred. Even the wind seemed hesitant, whispering only in the hollows. He carried little, a pouch of bread, a flask of water, and the humming in his heart that had guided him this far. Hours passed. His legs burned, his breath grew ragged, yet he pressed on. The mountain seemed to test him, forcing him to slow, to measure each step. It was not cruel, simply unyielding. By dusk he found a small ledge where stone jutted outward. He sat back against the rock, watching the land spread below like a vast painted scroll. Villages were tiny smudges of smoke and rooftops. Rivers glimmered faintly in twilight. For the first time, he saw how small his world had been. The mountain loomed higher still, its peak hidden in gathering clouds. He shivered, though not from cold. He whispered to himself, "Why do you call me?" No answer came. Only silence deeper than night. The second day of climbing was harder. The path narrowed, sometimes vanishing entirely. His hands scraped raw against stone. His boots slipped on loose gravel. At one point he stumbled, falling to his knees, breath torn from him. He pressed his forehead to the ground, trembling. A thought came, turn back. No one would blame him. The mountain was not meant for men. But as he knelt, a faint breeze touched his cheek. It carried no song, only presence. Quiet, steady, reminding him, you are not alone. He rose, aching but resolute. Step by step he climbed higher. On the third day, the mountain revealed its harshest self. The air thinned, sharp and cold. Clouds wrapped around him, blinding, soaking his clothes. The rock grew jagged, edges cutting his palms. Hunger gnawed at him, water nearly gone. He began to doubt, not the mountain but himself. What did he hope to find at the summit? A voice, a vision? Or nothing but emptiness? Yet he kept climbing. Because some journeys are not about answers, but about being changed by the path itself. By late afternoon, he broke through the clouds. Sunlight spilled like molten gold, dazzling his weary eyes. He gasped, not from effort, but from wonder. Above the sea of clouds, the world stretched endless, sky burning orange, peaks of distant ranges piercing the mist like islands. He wept without knowing why. At last, he reached the summit. It was not grand, not crowned with temples or thrones. Only a flat expanse of stone, bare and wind-scoured, open to sky in every direction. He stood, chest heaving, eyes wide. The silence here was unlike any he had known. It was not empty. It was full, saturated with presence. The mountain itself seemed alive, ancient and solemn. He felt its gaze, though it had no eyes. He felt its heart, though it did not beat. He knelt, palms against stone, whispering, I am here. And then the wind returned. It did not sing as before. It did not soothe. It roared across the summit, fierce and endless. It wrapped around him, tore at his clothes, rattled his bones. Yet within its power, he heard something, faint, immense, unshakable. The mountain was not lonely. It had always been full, of silence, of memory, of strength too vast for men to bear easily. Its solitude was not emptiness, but depth. He realized then loneliness was not always a wound. Sometimes it was a vessel, holding space for all that was too great, too heavy, too sacred to be shared easily. The mountain did not need him, but it welcomed him. And in that welcome he felt a part of himself shift. He stayed on the summit until stars ignited above. The wind softened, the silence deepened. He lay on his back, staring into infinity. For the first time he felt no need to hum, no need to listen. The world was enough, vast and whole, and he was simply a thread in its fabric. When dawn came, he began his descent. His body was weak, sore, battered, yet his heart was steady, stronger than when he began. The villagers were astonished when he returned. They asked what he had seen, what he had found. He only smiled and said, the mountain is not lonely. It is listening. From that day he carried something different in his eyes, not brighter, not louder, but deeper, like someone who had glimpsed eternity and returned quietly with its echo. Children noticed it most. They said that when he told stories, his voice carried the weight of stone, the calm of peaks, the vastness of sky. He no longer feared silence. He welcomed it, for silence was the mountain's language, and though he would still hum with the wind, still knead bread, still guide others with gentle presence, he carried within him a stillness that could not be shaken. The lonely mountain had not spoken in words. It had spoken in being, and that was enough. Some bonds are spoken into being. Others are silent, like rivers running beneath stone, steady and unseen until one day the earth shifts, and you realize they have carried you all along. He had always felt a quiet closeness with her, his sister, though not by blood, more by fate. She had been a part of his world for as long as he could remember, her laughter often the echo to his hums, her silence the balance to his own. Yet it was only as they grew older that he began to notice how deep that closeness ran, like a thread pulling them gently together no matter how far apart they strayed. She was not like him. Where he listened for the music of the wind, she listened for the heartbeat of the ground. As children, she would press her ear to the soil, claiming she could hear roots stretching, insects scuttling, the deep groan of earth turning beneath. He laughed at first, until one evening, lying beside her, he placed his own cheek against the grass, and in the hush, he too heard something faint and trembling, like a memory moving beneath the world. From then on, he believed her. They spent many evenings this way, shoulder to shoulder in a meadow or beneath a tree, saying little. She spoke when she wished, and he answered when words seemed needed, but mostly they let silence do the speaking. He did not always understand her words, but he always understood her heart. The bond grew in small ways. She stitched holes in his worn sleeves without asking. He shared crusts of bread even when food was scarce. They would walk to the river together, not to fish or fetch water, but simply to watch the ripples. When the wind sang, he would hum, and she would drum her fingers against her knee, weaving her own rhythm into his melody. It was as if their souls spoke in a language too old for mouths. Years passed, and the world pressed harder on them both. She grew restless, her eyes drawn often to the horizon. He grew quieter, seeking stillness in his strange gifts. And yet, no matter their differences, the thread between them did not loosen. There were moments of distance, arguments over nothing, over who forgot to tend the fire, over whether to take one path or another. She would storm away, hair tangled by the wind. He would remain kneading bread with tight shoulders. But always, by nightfall, they found their way back to each other's side. The bond was not perfect, but it was unbreakable. One autumn, when the leaves burned amber and gold, she announced she would leave for a time. She wanted to see the great forest beyond the plains, to climb cliffs where birds nested, to walk paths no one in their village had ever spoken of. He listened quietly, heart sinking. Part of him wanted to stop her, to ask her not to go. But another part, deeper, truer, knew that the thread between them was not meant to bind her still. So he nodded, placing bread in her satchel, pressing his forehead briefly against hers. "You'll return," he whispered, and she did. Seasons shifted. Each time she left, she returned changed. Her stories carried salt of the sea, dust of the desert, scent of pine forests. He listened to them all, never interrupting, eyes warm as she painted her adventures in words and gestures. And when she asked what he had done while she was gone, he only smiled. "I listened," he said, for though he did not wander as she did, he travelled too inward, through silences and songs, through quiet communion with mountain and wind. She laughed at him sometimes, calling him an old soul, but there was respect in her laughter, and love beneath it. One winter, when storms swept across the plains, she fell ill. Her strength, usually so fiery, ebbed like a tide. He sat beside her bed for days, humming softly, pressing cool cloths to her brow. At times she murmured half-dreamt words. "Don't let the thread break." And he promised, though she may not have heard, "It never will." She recovered, but slower than either expected. For the first time, she leaned on him more than he leaned on her. The balance shifted, yet the bond held. It was not only laughter and adventure that tied them, it was care given freely in weakness and strength alike. As the years stretched on, others in the village began to notice. Some whispered that they were more than siblings, more than friends. Others said nothing at all, only nodded knowingly when they saw them walking together, shoulder brushing shoulder. To him, labels mattered little. She was simply the other thread woven through his life, the line that gave his own pattern shape. One evening, late in spring, they climbed a hill outside the village. The sky was strewn with stars, brighter than they had ever seen. She lay back in the grass, hands folded behind her head. He sat beside her, humming faintly to the wind. "Do you ever wonder why we're tied like this?" she asked suddenly. He turned to her. "Like what? Like—" "No matter where I go, no matter what I see, it all feels less real until I tell you. As if the thread isn't just between us, it's what makes the world whole." He thought for a long moment, then lay back beside her. "Maybe we were given the same thread before we were given names." She smiled at that, and for a while they said nothing more, letting the stars burn quietly overhead. In time, the thread between them would guide choices larger than they could see then. It would pull them through griefs and joys, through distances longer than mountains, through silences deeper than oceans. But for now, it was enough to lie in the grass, to share bread, to hum and drum and laugh, for threads are not always loud. Some are quiet, woven through years, so constant that you forget they are there, until the day you reach for them and they hold. When the night grew late, they returned to the village together. She leaned lightly on his arm, not because she needed to, but because she wished to. And he let her, because some bonds do not ask, they simply are. The thread between them was not golden, nor shining, nor visible. But it was strong, strong enough to span absence, illness, anger, and silence. Strong enough to hold them both, gently but surely, for all the days to come. and though neither could have said where it began, both knew it would never end. Dreams have always been more than shadows of thought. In some, the body rests but the soul wanders, finding paths where waking eyes cannot go. And it was in dreams that he first began to glimpse the old gods. They did not appear as towering figures of fire or stone. They were not wrapped in lightning, nor crowned with thrones. Instead, they came in fragments, in murmurs, in shapes half remembered upon waking, in feelings that lingered like the aftertaste of honey. Yet even in such fleeting glimpses, he knew they were not of mortal kind. The first dream came in winter. He lay by the fire, sleep heavy upon him, when he found himself walking through a field of stars. Each step he took left ripples of light, like footsteps across a darkened pond. He heard a voice, not a word, not even a sound, but a weight upon the heart. The voice said nothing he could retell. And yet when he woke, he carried a stillness unlike any other. He felt as though someone ancient had placed their hand upon his shoulder and whispered, "Continue." Another night he dreamt of a tree. Its trunk was wider than a house, roots plunging deeper than oceans, branches stretching beyond sight. Upon its limbs hung countless lanterns, glowing softly in every shade of dawn. He reached to touch one lantern, and within it he saw his own life flicker, childhood laughter, quiet moments by rivers, the shape of his sister's smile. When he pulled back, the lantern dimmed as though reminding him, this too is only one light among many. When he woke, his chest ached with tenderness. He looked at the dawn sky, thinking of how every person might be a lantern upon that endless tree, swaying in winds only the gods could feel. The dreams grew more frequent. At times they were gentle, walking through endless fields of grass where voices hummed in harmony, though no faces appeared. At other times they were unsettling, carrying images that blurred between beauty and unease, oceans rising higher than mountains, skies cracked with strange light, cities swallowed by roots that grew faster than fire. Yet even in the troubling dreams he felt no terror, only awe, the sense that he was being shown not what would come but what could be. As if the gods whispered, all things live in possibility. Do not fear the vision. Learn from it. He told his sister of the dreams. At first she laughed, calling them fanciful. But as he described them, the lantern tree, the star-rippling steps, her laughter softened. She lay quiet beside him, listening. I've dreamt too, she admitted one night, eyes on the ceiling beams. Not the same, but I've seen rivers that ran with light instead of water, and once a bird larger than the sun. When it spread its wings, whole days vanished into night. They exchanged these fragments like secret treasures, too delicate to share with others, and in the sharing the thread between them deepened. One evening after many such nights, she asked him, "Do you think the gods are real?" He hesitated. "I think dreams are real. Whether they are gods, I cannot say," she nodded. "Perhaps it doesn't matter. If they guide us even in dreams, perhaps that is enough." As the seasons turned, his dreams began to braid into waking life. He would pause mid-step, feeling as though the air itself was humming. Sometimes he saw lanterns in the corners of his vision, flickering and vanishing. Once, standing by the river, he felt the current speak, not in words but in rhythm, echoing the pulse of his own heart. It frightened him at times, how thin the veil became between dream and day. Yet he also felt a growing peace. If the gods wished to reach him through dreams, who was he to resist? One dream remained clearer than the rest. He stood upon a shore of black sand. The ocean before him was not water, but liquid starlight, waves rising and falling in shimmering arcs. Upon the far horizon stood a figure, vast, robed in mist, faceless yet radiant. The figure raised its hand, and in that moment, he felt every memory of his life flow outward, as though the figure was gathering them, holding them, honoring them. He did not lose them, they returned, but lighter, softer, as if sorrow had been washed clean, leaving only love. When he woke, he wept without knowing why. The villagers began to notice changes. His eyes often wandered far, as though seeing beyond what lay before him. His silences grew longer, though not empty. They were filled with listening. Some thought him strange. Others whispered he was blessed. Children followed him, asking what he had seen in dreams. He told them only this: "I see what reminds me to be gentle, nothing more." But in truth he carried those visions like hidden seeds, unsure yet how they would bloom. There came a night when no dream came at all. He slept deeply, blankly, waking with a heaviness he had not felt in months. For a moment he feared the gods had turned away, but as he sat beneath the morning sky, a new understanding stirred. The silence, too, was a gift. The absence of vision was its own reminder that not every night must carry revelation. Some nights are for rest alone, and so he learned to receive both the visions and the silences with equal reverence. In time, he began to share pieces of the dreams with others, not their strangeness but their wisdom. He spoke gently, saying things like, "The lanterns remind us that each life matters, no matter how small. The mountain's silence is not loneliness, it is listening. The river's rhythm teaches us to move forward, even when we do not see the end." The villagers did not know these words came from gods or dreams. They only felt calmed by them, as though something greater spoke through him, translated into tenderness. His sister teased him sometimes, calling him a half-dreamer, more spirit than man. But her eyes shone with pride when she said it, and in her own silences he saw that she too was listening to the earth, to the gods, to whatever truths the world revealed in sleep. As he grew, he came to understand. The gods were not distant rulers demanding worship. They were whispers, reminders, fragments of wonder that threaded through both dreams and days. Their power was not in thunder or lightning, but in the way they taught him to see beauty in small things. The flicker of a candle, the hush of snow, the way two hands could share warmth in silence, and perhaps that was the greatest dream of all. He knew one day the dreams might fade entirely. Mortals are not meant to live forever in visions, but whether they continued or ended, the gods had already given him enough, a way of seeing, a way of listening, a way of being gentle with the world. When he closed his eyes at night, he no longer sought the visions with urgency. Instead, he whispered softly, "If you come, I will listen. If you do not, I will rest," and either way he slept in peace. Fire was never just flame. To the villagers it was warmth, light, survival. To him it was also memory, each spark a story, each ember a lingering breath of something once alive. Yet for all its beauty, fire was feared. Too much of it, and homes could vanish. Too little, and hearts grew cold. It was during one long winter that he came to understand fire differently, not as destruction nor comfort alone, but as a teacher. The cold that year was merciless. Snow fell early, blanketing fields and choking paths. Trees bent beneath its weight, branches snapping like brittle bones. Villagers huddled indoors, conserving wood, rationing food. Every hearth seemed smaller, weaker. Even laughter grew scarce, smothered beneath frost. One evening, as he walked through the village, he noticed a small cottage on the edge of the square. Its chimney was dark, no smoke curling into the sky. He knocked gently, and the door opened to reveal an old woman wrapped in blankets, her breath clouding the air inside. Her fire had died that morning, she said. She had no strength to fetch wood from the shed, and no one had noticed her silence. He did not hesitate. He gathered logs, struck flint, and coaxed a flame back to life in her hearth. The fire sputtered at first, then grew, orange light pushing shadows back into corners. The woman's eyes glistened as warmth returned to her home. "Fire listens to gentle hands," she murmured, reaching toward the heat. That night, he dreamt of flames, not as hunger, but as song. Each flicker hummed, each spark whispered, weaving into a chorus of warmth. When he woke, the dream lingered, carrying with it a lesson he could not yet name. As the winter deepened, he made it his task to tend the fires of others. He rose before dawn, moving from house to house, checking chimneys, carrying kindling, teaching children how to stack wood so it breathed easily. At first, some laughed at his care, but as nights grew harsher, his presence became a quiet reassurance, like an ember hidden in ash waiting to glow. He discovered that fire was gentlest when treated as a companion, not a tool. When one struck it too harshly, it resisted. When one fed it too greedily, it consumed. But when coaxed patiently, air given, wood placed with thought, it bloomed into steady warmth. He spoke of this often, comparing it to the heart. "If you smother it," he said, "the flame dies. If you demand too much, it burns wild. But if you tend it with care, it lasts through the coldest nights." One evening, his sister returned from a long journey, her cheeks red with cold. She found him crouched before a hearth, coaxing coals into flame. She watched quietly, then said, "You treat fire as if it were alive. He smiled. Perhaps it is. She sat beside him, holding her hands near the glow. I once thought fire was only hunger. It eats everything it touches. It can, he agreed, but it can also give back more than it takes. It depends on how we hold it. She nodded slowly, as if the words struck deeper than the fire's warmth. There was one night late in that bitter winter when the fire tested him. A storm howled through the village, winds fierce enough to tear roofs, snow blinding and endless. In the chaos, one cottage caught flame, its roof brittle with age, kindled by a stray spark from the hearth. Shouts filled the square. Villagers rushed with buckets, but the storm scattered their efforts. The fire spread, devouring dry wood, leaping hungrily. He stood in the snow, heart pounding. For a moment, terror seized him. This was the fire's truest face, wild and merciless. But then beneath the roar he felt the echo of his dream. Fire was not only destruction, it was voice. It could be answered. He closed his eyes, breathing slow, listening. And in that silence he understood. The fire did not rage out of malice. It raged because it was untended, unbalanced, called forth without care. He joined the villagers, but not with frantic haste. He moved with calm, guiding others to where water mattered most, where snow packed tight could smother embers. His voice was steady, his hands sure. Slowly the flames subsided, steam rising as fire surrendered back to silence. The cottage was scarred, roof half lost. Yet the villagers lived. The fire tamed without spreading further. And in the stillness that followed, many turned to him with awe. You did not fear it, one said. He shook his head softly. I respected it. That night, as he sat by the embers of his own hearth, he thought of how the fire had tested him. And he realized strength was not in conquering flame, nor in fleeing it, but in tending it with gentleness even when it roared. As spring returned, he carried this lesson into his days. When anger rose in him, he treated it like fire, acknowledging its heat but not letting it consume. When grief smoldered, he fed it small air, letting it burn quietly rather than choke him. And when joy sparked, he tended it patiently, so it would last rather than vanish in a flash. The villagers noticed the change. They began to call him when quarrels threatened to flare, when tempers burned too hot. He listened, spoke softly, and helped them find balance. Fire, he would say, teaches us to breathe. Let it guide you, not control you. His sister teased him, saying he had become half fire himself, always glowing quietly, never burning out. But in her eyes was respect, and in her smile warmth. Years later, when children asked him about that harsh winter, he would tell them gently, "Fire is neither enemy nor friend. It is what you make of it. Treat it with reverence and it will keep you alive. Neglect it and it will devour. But always remember, like the heart, it burns brightest when tended with patience." And sometimes, when the night grew late and silence gathered, he would add, almost in a whisper, "The gods do not only speak in dreams, sometimes they speak in flames." He never forgot the night the storm came, nor the countless evenings spent feeding embers in quiet homes. Fire had taught him what no dream could, that gentleness is not weakness but balance. That warmth requires effort, not accident, and that sometimes to keep others alive, one must kneel in the dark and breathe life into coals until they glow. It was not a grand lesson, not a tale of conquest or glory, but it was enough. For in the end, what greater power could there be than learning how to keep others warm? And so he tended not just hearths but hearts. And wherever he went, the gentle fire went with him. There is a language spoken without words, a language older than any written scroll or carved tablet. It is the language of hands, the quiet touch that mends, the gentle motion that soothes. He discovered this language not through study, but through necessity. When pain entered the lives of those he loved, and asked for something more than fire or food. It began with a child, no older than 6, who had fallen while playing near the frozen square. Her leg was scraped, her sobs sharp in the cold air. Villagers gathered, murmuring, unsure. He knelt beside her, not with instructions or commands, but with stillness. "Let me see," he whispered. The girl hesitated, but his voice was steady, his eyes kind. She extended her small leg, trembling. He washed the wound with melted snow, slow and deliberate, speaking softly of clouds and rivers so her tears eased. Then he wrapped the scrape with cloth, not tight, just enough to protect. When he finished, he smiled and said, "Your skin is brave. It will remember how to close itself." The child sniffled, then gave a small nod. And when she stood, limping but smiling, the villagers looked at him differently, not as one who only tended fire, but as one whose touch itself carried warmth. From then on, people began to seek him in moments of hurt, a cut from chopping wood, a fever that would not break, a back bent with years of labor. He did not call himself healer, for he had no medicines beyond herbs, no powers beyond patience. Yet what he offered was something few gave freely: time, care, presence. He listened to pain as if it were a story, not an interruption. He touched wounds as if they were sacred, not shameful. And slowly, people began to trust that his hands could ease what words could not. One evening, his sister returned from a hunt, her arm gashed by a wild branch. She brushed it off at first, insisting it was nothing. But he guided her to sit by the fire, his hands steady even as blood stained the cloth. "You never worry for yourself," he said softly, binding her wound. "I have no need," she replied. Though her voice wavered with pain, he looked at her, meeting her eyes. Even stone cracks without care. For once she had no answer. She only let him work, her silence a kind of surrender. When he finished, she flexed her arm, wincing, but her eyes glimmered with gratitude. "You heal with more than hands," she murmured. But he shook his head. "No, I only remind the body of what it already knows, to knit, to mend, to rise again." The truth was he did not believe himself gifted. He believed in patience, in watching, in allowing wounds the space to breathe. He saw healing not as conquering pain, but as walking beside it until it loosened its grip. Sometimes he simply sat with those in sorrow, saying nothing, letting silence be the balm. Other times he brewed teas of roots and leaves, offering comfort more than cure. Always he gave his hands not as miracles, but as steady companions. There was one night, however, when healing asked more of him than he thought he could give. A villager, a farmer known for his laughter, fell ill in the spring. His skin burned with fever, his breath rattled. The village whispered of death. They said nothing could be done, but the farmer's wife came to him, eyes wide with pleading. He entered the cottage, the air thick with heat and fear. The man lay on his bed, sweat pooling, eyes unfocused. For a moment doubt flooded him. He was no healer, no god. What could his hands do against such fire within? But then he remembered the old woman whose hearth he had rekindled, the child whose wound had closed, his sister's quiet trust. Healing was not about defeating death. It was about offering life whatever strength one had. He knelt beside the man, placing a cool cloth on his forehead. He whispered not spells but memories, stories of fields, of harvests, of laughter by the river. He guided the man's breathing, slow, steady, as if drawing rhythm back into him. Hour after hour he stayed, replacing cloths, offering sips of water, never leaving. The night stretched long and exhaustion pulled at his bones. Yet he stayed, because leaving would mean surrender, and surrender was not what healing meant. By dawn, the fever broke. The man's breath eased, his skin cooled, his eyes fluttered open, and though weak, he smiled faintly. "You sat with me through the fire," he whispered, and he answered softly, "I only tended your flame until it calmed." After that night, word spread beyond the village. Travelers spoke of the one whose hands brought ease. Some came seeking cures, but he offered no promises, only presence. Sometimes the ill grew well, sometimes they did not. Yet even in death, families said, there was peace in the way he stayed, in the way he held hands until the very end, as if no one had to cross alone. He often wondered where this gift had come from. Was it truly from the gods, or was it simply the human ability to care? Perhaps there was no difference. Perhaps the gods had only planted seeds, and each person decided whether to water them with kindness or let them wither. He did not claim mastery. His hands trembled at times, his heart ached with each loss. But he learned that healing was not perfection. It was the choice to meet brokenness with gentleness again and again, even when weary. One dusk, as he watched the sky burn with fading light, his sister sat beside him. "Do you ever wish for greater power?" she asked. He thought long before answering. "Once I did. But now I see power without tenderness is hollow, and tenderness even without power can be enough." She leaned against his shoulder, silent as stars began to prick the sky. Years later, when children gathered at his feet, begging for stories, he told them this: "The world is full of wounds, on skin, on earth, in hearts. You will see them everywhere. Some you cannot close, some you cannot even touch. But never forget, you always carry two gifts, time and hands. Offer them freely. Sit with the wounded. Hold the lonely. Bind what you can, and when you cannot heal, simply stay. The children listened, eyes wide, and some reached out to place their small hands in his. He smiled, feeling the circle complete. The language of healing carried forward. Simple and eternal, and when he was alone, tending his own fire, he sometimes looked at his hands, scarred, lined, weary, and thought, these are not the hands of a hero. They are the hands of one who stayed, and that, he knew, was enough. There are places that teach us without words, places where time softens its grip and the heart remembers its own rhythm. For him, that place was the garden at dusk, a patch of soil and stone, neither grand nor wild, yet alive with a quiet magic. It began as little more than a small corner of earth, forgotten at the edge of the village. Weeds had claimed it, rocks scattered like bones. Few looked twice at it, for there were richer fields, sturdier orchards, and clearer rivers elsewhere. But he, wandering in search of stillness, felt something stir the first time he stepped there. The light of evening lay gentle on the ground, painting weeds in hues of gold, turning broken stones into quiet monuments. He paused, kneeling to brush a leaf with his fingertips. Something about the air was softer here, as though the soil itself held breath waiting to be noticed. So he returned. Day after day he pulled weeds, set stones aside, loosened soil. He planted little at first, herbs hardy and small. Mint, thyme, a bit of sage, things the village often overlooked, but which filled the air with fragrance when touched. And as the seasons passed, the place began to change. Or perhaps it was he who changed, learning how patience reshapes the world. At dusk, when others gathered by fires or hurried home, he lingered in the garden. The light was never harsh then. It filtered through leaves, slipped across petals, spilled like a secret only he was meant to hear. The air cooled, the day sighed, and in that sigh he found his own breath loosening. The garden was not vast, yet it carried more lessons than he could count. The herbs taught resilience, thriving in thin soil. The stones taught stillness, shaping paths with their weight. Even weeds carried wisdom. They grew where nothing else would, stubborn, insistent that life finds a way. He learned to see beauty not in perfection, but in persistence. Others began to notice. Children came to taste leaves that smelled of lemon. Elders sought sprigs of herbs for their teas. Travelers, passing through, paused at its edge and remarked on the peace they felt there. But to him the garden was not for showing. It was for listening. Sometimes he hummed among the plants and the leaves trembled as if answering. Sometimes he pressed his palms into the soil, closing his eyes, feeling warmth rise from below. He began to think of the garden as a friend, one that held his secrets without judgment, one that grew quietly simply because it could. One evening, his sister found him there, bent low among the herbs. She stood at the edge, arms crossed, watching. "You spend more time with plants than with people," she teased. He looked up, dirt smudging his cheek, and smiled. "Plants do not argue. They also do not listen." "Ah, but they do," he said, rising, brushing soil from his hands. He held out a sprig of mint. "Here, taste," she sighed, but plucked a leaf, pressing it against her tongue. Her eyes widened faintly at the coolness spreading through her mouth. "Perhaps," she admitted. "They listen after all." From then on she visited more often, sometimes to sit in silence, sometimes to talk. And he realized the garden was not only for him, it was for anyone willing to step gently into its dusk. As years passed, the garden grew richer. Vines climbed stones, flowers spread in unexpected corners, bees and butterflies found a home there. He planted fruit bushes at the edges, so travelers might take a handful without asking. He built a bench from driftwood, set where the last light touched longest. It became a place of meeting, of parting, of reflection. Lovers carved initials into the wood. Elders told stories under its shade. Children learned patience in watching seedlings rise. Yet even as it became part of the village's rhythm, dusk remained his own hour. The world slowed then. Shadows lengthened, and he felt the hum of everything, plants, stones, sky, woven into one soft song. He often thought of dusk as a threshold. Day leaned into night, not with haste, but with grace. The garden seemed to hold that grace, reminding him that all endings could be gentle, all closings tender. Sometimes he wondered if this was why he had come into the world with his peculiar gifts, not to stretch or sing or wander, but simply to tend, to place his hands where life might grow, to offer space where others might breathe. The garden gave him no answers, only blossoms, only leaves, only silence. Yet that was enough. There was one evening he never forgot. The air was warm, cicadas droning faintly, the sky painted in streaks of violet. An old woman, bent with years, entered the garden with hesitant steps. She sat beside him on the bench, breathing shallow, eyes tired. "I am nearing my dusk," she whispered. He said nothing, only placed his hand over hers. They sat that way as light faded. She spoke of her youth, of children grown and gone, of the loneliness that sometimes pressed her chest. He listened, not rushing, not trying to mend what was not broken. When the first stars appeared, she sighed. "I thought dusk was only loss, but perhaps it is also rest." "Yes," he said softly, "rest and remembering." She closed her eyes then, not to sleep forever, but to breathe easier. When she left, she kissed his brow and said, "Thank you for giving me a garden to meet the night." Her words stayed with him long after. As years unfolded, so too did he. The garden mirrored his growth, scarred, imperfect, yet abundant. Some seasons were harsh, storms tearing branches, drought cracking soil, but even in loss new life returned, sometimes where least expected. He began to see himself not as master of the garden, but as companion. The soil would outlast him, the plants would grow long after he was gone. He was only a caretaker for a little while, at the threshold of dusk, and strangely, this thought brought him peace. One evening, sitting alone on the bench, he whispered to the earth, "If I leave nothing else behind, let it be this place." And in the quiet, he thought he heard the leaves rustle in answer. When he rose to go, the last light spilling across his path, he felt a truth settle into him like cool soil around a root. We do not always choose our legacies. Sometimes they bloom quietly, tended by our hands, carried forward by those who will sit where we once sat, breathe the same dusk, and feel the same peace. The garden at dusk was not his creation alone. It was his conversation with time, with patience, with the tender insistence of life, and it would go on speaking, long after his own voice grew silent. And so he walked home, leaving the garden in the arms of night. Behind him the last blossoms folded, the last bees returned to their hives, and the stars began to rise above. The dusk was complete, and the garden, like him, rested. There are voices that never use words, yet once you hear them, you cannot forget. For him, one of those voices belonged to the clouds. They did not shout or demand, yet they carried messages across the sky, slow and deliberate, as if time itself were their tongue. As a child, he often lay in fields with his back pressed to the grass, staring upward until the sky filled his vision. Others saw only shapes in passing, animals, faces, towers. He, however, felt something deeper. The clouds did not merely resemble things. They spoke of them, breathed them, reminded him of stories older than the village. He told this once to his sister, who laughed, teasing him for listening to vapors. But when he remained silent, eyes steady, she grew quiet too. And after a pause she asked, almost whispering, "What are they saying now?" He smiled faintly, pointing to a long silver stretch above. "That one tells of rivers, of journeys that do not end." She looked up, and though she shook her head, she stayed beside him, watching. That was the beginning of their shared evenings, waiting for the sky to speak. The clouds became his teachers in ways no elder could have arranged. They showed him the art of patience, drifting without hurry, shifting without protest. They revealed the truth of impermanence, forming castles and dissolving them moments later. They reminded him that even heaviness had purpose, for rain must fall if fields are to grow. He carried these lessons quietly, letting them soften his edges. When others rushed, he remembered the slow drift above. When he faced loss, he thought of how clouds never clung to a shape, yet never ceased to return. One summer evening, while the sky blushed with fading light, he felt the clouds call louder than before. They gathered thick and luminous, glowing with hues of rose and amber, as if painted by unseen hands. He sat on the hill, his heart open, and for the first time he thought he heard not just lessons but music. It was not sound, not in the way wind or rivers sang. It was more like the echo of something remembered, deep, soft, almost like a lullaby hummed at the edge of hearing. He closed his eyes, and the melody seeped through him, loosening knots of worry he had not known he carried. When he opened them, the clouds had shifted again, but the music lingered in his chest. From then on, he called it the voice of clouds. Others could not hear it. Or perhaps they did, but in their own way. Some felt it as comfort after sorrow, some as inspiration before journeys. But he heard it as song, a slow, endless hymn that stretched across the horizon, and in time he learned to hum it back. It became his habit to sit alone at twilight, eyes lifted, voice low. He hummed not for attention nor for audience, but as a way of joining. The clouds carried their vast, wordless song, and he, small and human, added his faint note like a thread woven into a great tapestry. Sometimes his sister joined him. She did not hum, but she listened, her head resting lightly on his shoulder. In those moments, he felt the bond between them carried upward, stitched into the drifting sky. Once, during a drought, when fields cracked and cattle moaned with thirst, villagers asked him to sing to the clouds. They spoke half in jest, half in hope. He did not refuse. That night, he climbed the hill alone. The sky was cruelly clear, stars sharp and cold, no cloud in sight. Still he hummed. Not for rain, not for miracles, but for remembrance. That water, too, had voice and would one day return. He hummed until his throat ached, until dawn bruised the sky. And though no rain came that morning, within days the horizon darkened and storms swept across the fields. The villagers looked at him with awe, whispering that the clouds had answered his song. He only shook his head. The clouds answer no one. They simply remind us that all things return in their time. Yet quietly, he wondered if perhaps they had heard him after all. One autumn, his sister asked him, "Do you ever think the clouds carry souls?" He tilted his head, considering. "Sometimes," she continued, "I imagine the ones we've lost drift there, watching, shifting. Too far to touch, but not gone, just changed." He did not answer at once. Instead, he traced a cloud with his gaze, long and thin, stretching across the horizon. Finally, he said, "If that's true, then they speak to us more often than we realize." And in her silence, he heard agreement. Years deepened his bond with the sky. He learned to read the moods of clouds, gentle veils that promised calm, heavy bellies that warned of storms, scattered wisps that whispered of travel. He never claimed mastery, only companionship. To him, the sky was a book always being written, and clouds were its sentences, fleeting yet meaningful. He read them not to predict, but to understand. There was one dusk, late in life, that etched itself into his memory. He stood at the garden's edge, the air heavy with approaching rain. Above, the clouds thickened, their undersides glowing with lightning, yet their tops lit by the last rays of sun. It was both storm and serenity at once. He hummed softly at first, then louder, his voice steady despite the rumble above. And for a moment, just a moment, he felt the clouds hum back. It was not echo, not thunder. It was something deeper, like a chord struck between sky and earth, like a hand resting gently on his shoulder from above. His breath caught and tears pricked his eyes. In that instant he knew the truth. The voice of clouds was not only song. It was memory. It was love stretched thin across the sky. It was the reminder that nothing, once carried upward, is ever truly gone. Afterward, when he told his sister, she did not laugh or question. She only said, "Then keep singing. So they remember us too." And he did. Night after night, as dusk leaned into night, he hummed. Not to call, not to command, but to join. To be part of the vast, slow hymn of clouds. The voice of clouds was never loud. It did not pierce or startle. It drifted, softened, lingered like mist over the heart. And in listening, he learned perhaps the most important lesson of all, that the world does not need to be conquered to be heard. It only needs to be attended gently with patience until its quiet voice becomes clear. So he kept listening, and whenever the sky grew heavy, whenever loss pressed upon him, he tilted his head upward, waiting, and always eventually the clouds spoke sometimes. The greatest wonders arrive not through storms or revelations, but in the gentlest of pairings, ordinary things resting beside infinite ones. For him, that pairing was sandwiches and stars. He could not remember when the ritual began, only that it felt as if it had always been there. At dusk, after the fields quieted and the air cooled, he would pack a simple bundle. Bread, a slice of cheese, perhaps a sprig of herbs if they were fresh in the garden. Nothing extravagant, nothing to impress. He would climb the hill where the grass bowed to the wind, sit upon the same patch worn smooth by his visits, and eat while the stars bloomed one by one across the darkening sky. Bread in hand, gaze lifted, it became his private ceremony. A reminder that the simplest food could taste like a feast when paired with the company of constellations. At first, it was merely his own practice, a small comfort to end the day. But his sister soon noticed the way he slipped away each evening. One night she followed, carrying her own piece of bread. "You could have told me," she teased, settling beside him. He only smiled, handing her half of his cheese, and so without grand words the ritual became theirs. They ate slowly, watching the sky unfold. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they did not. Silence never weighed heavy between them. It was filled by the quiet crackle of grass, the murmur of crickets, the vast whisper of stars arranging themselves above. The sandwiches changed over the years, sometimes richer, sometimes poorer, but the essence never did. There were evenings of laughter, when they joked that the stars might be crumbs dropped by gods who had also eaten sandwiches in the sky. And there were evenings of sorrow when silence stretched long, and bread was chewed more slowly, as though time itself needed gentleness. Yet in both, the stars always remained. Faithful witnesses. One evening stands brighter in memory than the rest. The air was crisp, autumn's first chill, and the sky impossibly clear. They lay back on the hill, crumbs scattered at their sides, and traced constellations with their fingers. "Do you think the stars eat too?" she asked. He chuckled. "What would they eat?" "Each other," she said with a mock seriousness. "Or maybe us when we're not careful." They both laughed, but then grew quiet, gazing upward. He finally said, "If they eat anything, it's our wishes. And maybe our loneliness." She tilted her head. "Then I'll give them mine. Let them eat it all." It was a small conversation, yet it stayed with him forever. The idea that stars consumed sorrow, leaving behind only light. Seasons turned, and still the sandwiches and stars remained. Even as life grew heavier, as tasks multiplied and responsibilities pressed, the ritual endured. Some evenings were hurried, a quick bite under a cloudy sky. Others were luxurious, long hours stretched out until midnight, sharing secrets with the heavens. The hill became more than a place. It became a sanctuary. And the sandwiches were more than food. They were a tether, grounding them to the ordinary while their hearts reached toward the infinite. As he grew older, he began to notice something new. The stars no longer felt distant. Their cold brilliance softened into familiarity, like faces glimpsed again and again until they seemed like neighbors. He would point to one steady and bright and whisper, "That one's been here every night I've come." His sister would nod, smiling. "Then it knows us by now." The thought comforted him deeply, the idea that the stars bore witness, that they carried his presence across the years. No matter how fleeting his own life might be, there were nights when clouds covered the sky, hiding every spark. On those evenings, the sandwiches were eaten more slowly, with a touch of disappointment. Yet even then he felt the stars above veiled but not vanished. "Sometimes," he said once, "I think the stars want us to trust them, even when we cannot see." His sister leaned against him, nodding, like friends who walk behind you in the dark. And so even absence became part of the ritual. Trust was added to the bread, faith to the cheese. One winter, when the air stung and snow lined the hill, they carried sandwiches wrapped in cloth to keep warm. The stars above were sharper than ever, brittle with clarity. They ate with fingers numb, but their laughter filled the night, smoke rising from their breath. "I think," she said between bites, "that when we're gone, we'll become sandwiches and stars." He laughed so hard he nearly dropped his bread. But later, lying in bed, the phrase circled back to him. Sandwiches and stars, not one without the other, earth and sky, hunger and wonder, bound in a single ritual. Years scattered as years do. There came evenings when he climbed the hill alone, carrying only one sandwich. The silence was heavier then, but he did not avoid it. He chewed slowly, lifting his gaze, and whispered into the sky, "She's here too. She's always here." And though no voice answered, the stars seemed brighter on those nights, as if agreeing silently. As he aged further, his steps slowed, yet he refused to abandon the ritual. The hill was harder to climb, the bread harder to chew, but the stars remained as faithful as ever. Each night felt like a continuation of a long conversation, stretching from childhood to old age. He began to hum softly as he ate, a tune he had carried from the clouds, weaving it now into this ritual. Sandwiches, stars, and song, the trinity of his evenings. One twilight he brought along a grandchild, placing a sandwich into the small hands. The child looked puzzled but followed him up the hill. "Why do we eat here?" the child asked. He smiled, eyes on the horizon. "Because stars make bread taste better." The child laughed, taking a bite, then gasped at the sight of constellations forming above. Their eyes widened, crumbs falling forgotten onto the grass. "Will they always be there?" "Yes," he said softly, "always. Even when we can't see them." And so the ritual passed on. The hill knew new footsteps, new voices, new laughter carried upward. Sandwiches and stars continued to pair, as if the sky itself had grown accustomed to waiting for them. Looking back, he realized the lesson had been simple all along. Life does not demand grand feasts or unreachable wonders. Sometimes the deepest beauty is found in bread, shared beneath infinite skies. The sandwiches fed the body, the stars fed the soul. Together they reminded him that to be alive was to be both small and vast, both hungry and full. And every evening as he finished the last bite, he tilted his head back, whispered a thank you, and let the stars answer in silence. The first time he stood before the sea, it felt less like arriving at a place, and more like being welcomed into the arms of something immeasurable. The horizon curved away endlessly, a breath that stretched beyond sight, and the waves moved with the patience of a timeless heart. He did not rush toward it. Instead, he stood still, toes pressed into sand, letting the rhythm of the tide seep slowly into him. Each wave was a gesture, forward then retreat, like the ocean was bowing and rising in an endless greeting. "Do you hear it?" his mentor once asked, long ago when they had spoken of things larger than themselves. "The sea never shouts, it sings." Now standing alone, he finally understood. The ocean's song was not a melody but a breathing presence, low and constant, both powerful and gentle. In childhood, rivers and streams had been his companions. He had dipped his feet in brooks, skipped stones across ponds, whispered secrets to creeks that glimmered with dragonflies. But the sea, this was no creek, no tame flow. It was vastness itself, and yet despite its enormity he felt no fear, only awe, only reverence. The air carried salt, sharp yet clean, and the gulls wheeled above in slow arcs. He knelt, scooping a handful of water, cool and foaming, and tasted it upon his lips. The salt clung, a reminder that the ocean was both giver and keeper, sustaining and consuming, a cradle and a grave. That night he built a small fire upon the shore, the driftwood crackling, while the waves kept their slow rhythm. He unwrapped his simple food, a ritual carried from the Hill of Stars, and ate quietly. This time, though, he looked not up but outward, toward the edge where sea met sky. The firelight danced on the water's skin, and he wondered how many others across centuries had sat in this very posture, gazing, chewing, reflecting, hearing the same eternal voice. The thought was comforting. He was not alone. He was part of a lineage of listeners. As days passed, the ocean became teacher as much as companion. He learned its moods, how it whispered gently at dawn, how it thundered at dusk when storms gathered, how it stretched silent and wide at noon. Reflecting the sky like a polished mirror, he noticed that the sea never truly repeated itself. Each wave was unique, each ripple unreturning. Yet together they formed a whole, one seamless movement, unbroken. It reminded him of people, the way every life was singular, yet all belonged to the same tide. He began to walk its edge at sunset, toes brushing the froth. The water pulled and released as if testing his willingness to dance with it. At first he resisted, stepping back, but soon he let himself be taken ankle deep, feeling the cool embrace swirl around him. It was not frightening. It was an invitation. The ocean seemed to say, "Let go. I will carry what you cannot hold." And so in quiet ways he did. Each evening he whispered into the wind the small burdens of the day, the unspoken aches, the regrets too tender to share aloud. The tide pulled them away, scattering them into foam. By morning the griefs had thinned, replaced with something lighter, gentler. One night, as he sat alone with only the stars and the ocean for company, he remembered his sister. The hill of sandwiches and stars rose in his mind, her laughter still echoing. For a moment the ache of her absence pressed heavy against his chest. He whispered her name into the salt air. The waves answered, carrying her name outward again and again, until it dissolved into the endless hush, and somehow he felt lighter, as though the ocean had promised, "She is not gone. She is here. She is everywhere." He closed his eyes, letting the sound of the tide cradle him like a lullaby. As the years unfolded, he noticed something subtle. The sea was not always soft. Sometimes it raged, foaming and roaring, breaking driftwood and scattering stones. But even then, its fury never felt cruel. It was alive, honest, incapable of pretending calm when storms brewed within. He admired that. The ocean did not hide its tempests, and yet it always returned to stillness. Its anger did not last forever. From it he learned that his own storms too would pass, that no grief or anger could hold its grip endlessly, that the cycle was always rage, soften, release, return. One evening, as he traced shells along the shore, a child approached, barefoot, carrying a stick as a sword. The child stopped, staring at the waves. "Does it end somewhere?" the child asked. He smiled, kneeling. "Yes and no. It ends on one shore and begins on another, like breathing in and out." The child considered this, then poked the water with the stick, laughing as the foam swallowed it. "Then it's like us, isn't it? We end here and begin again somewhere else." He placed a gentle hand on the child's shoulder. "Exactly so." And in that moment he realized the ocean was teaching not only him, but anyone willing to listen. There were nights when the moon spilled silver upon the water, turning every crest into a shining blade. He would sit until his eyes blurred with sleep, listening to the hush of the tide. The ocean became lullaby, rocking him gently toward dreams. Other times clouds covered the sky and the waves thudded in darkness. But even then, the sound was steady, like a heart continuing its beat no matter the shadows. It reassured him, no matter what happened in his small life, the ocean would keep breathing. The world would go on. In old age, his steps slowed, yet he still returned to the shore. Sometimes he only sat, no fire, no food, just listening. The sound seemed woven into his very bones, a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. He thought then of all the embraces he had known, his mother's when he was small, his sister's laughter against his shoulder, his mentor's steadying hand. Each had been precious, but none compared to this, the ocean's embrace, constant and unending, holding him even when no one else remained. One evening, as twilight deepened and his body felt heavier than ever before, he whispered to the tide, "When I can no longer come to you, take me in," the waves answered, pulling close, brushing his ankles like a promise, and he knew they would. Looking back, he saw that the sea had not merely been water or waves. It had been a teacher, a friend, a mirror. It had held his grief, his laughter, his aging body, and his fragile heart. It had asked for nothing in return but presence, and so he gave it. Night after night, year after year, he gave his listening, his silence, his wonder. The ocean embraced it all. Storms arrive quietly, sometimes unnoticed, like sorrow sneaking between moments of joy. And sometimes they arrive with fury, shaking doors, bending trees, flooding streets. He had learned early that life's tempests could not be avoided, but they could be met. That is what the lantern was for. It was not a grand lantern nor a magical one, merely a glass and metal cylinder, inside a flickering flame. He carried it always on nights when clouds pressed low and the wind roared in hungry gusts. The lantern did not stop the storm. It did not command it to pass. But it made the path visible both outside and within. On his first evening with it, the wind tore at his cloak, rain slicked against his cheeks, and he wondered why he had bothered. The village seemed to vanish into grey, the trees bending as if to bow. Yet he lifted the lantern and stepped forward, and the light carved a small circle of safety around him. One step at a time he moved, it became ritual. Whenever tempests rose, he would carry the lantern into the heart of them. Neighbors whispered of his bravery, yet he never considered it such. He only knew that light, no matter how small, was a friend against darkness. The storm did not end at his feet. Rain soaked his hair, wind bruised his skin, lightning danced across the sky. Yet the lantern did not falter. It shivered, flickered, but held, and so did he. There were nights when the storm brought travelers, lost and trembling on roads slick with water. The lantern's glow drew them near, not forcefully, not urgently, but as if the light itself had called their name. "Here," he would say softly, holding the lantern high. "Step forward. You are safe. No one ever questioned the calmness in his voice. It carried a quiet assurance, the kind that does not shout or command but simply offers a way. And slowly, the travelers found it. Step by step, footfall by footfall, the lantern guided them to shelter. It was not always the storm outside that mattered. Sometimes the tempest raged within. Loneliness, fear, loss. He had carried that lantern through nights when grief pressed tight against his chest, when memories clawed too sharply. He learned to place it near those shadows, not to banish them, but to illuminate the corners, to remind himself that darkness could exist alongside warmth. It was there he discovered a subtle truth. Light need not conquer the storm. Its presence alone sufficed. One night, as the ocean thrashed nearby, he saw a child clinging to a broken cart, frightened and shivering. The wind tore at hair and cloak, and the waves beat in rhythm with the pounding rain. He lifted the lantern, letting its glow fall across the child's face. "Take my hand," he said, voice steady against the roar. The child hesitated, but then, trusting instinct more than words, reached out. Step by step, they navigated puddles and mud, guided by the small flame. Not once did he rush. Not once did he panic. The lantern swung gently, casting shadows that danced like sentries. When they reached a dry doorway, the child's eyes, wide and shining, locked on his. "How?" He only shrugged, smiling softly. "The light always knows the way. Sometimes we just need to follow." Storms taught him patience. They taught him humility. They reminded him that control was an illusion. Only care, steadiness, and attention could steer one through the chaos. And as he carried the lantern night after night, he discovered something unexpected. Even others began to carry their own lights. First a neighbor, timid, then a traveler, unsure, and eventually the village itself seemed to glow faintly against the darkness. The storm was still fierce, but together they found rhythm. Step by step, glow by glow, there were evenings when the storm passed as quietly as it had come, leaving only puddles and shattered branches. Yet he did not put the lantern away immediately. He left it on the porch near the hearth, watching the residual shadows, allowing its glow to linger. Even after the sky cleared, the lantern reminded him that storms were neither endless nor all-consuming. They were temporary, and sometimes that lesson alone was enough. One late autumn, the storm brought a message. His sister, older now, reached the village by nightfall, drenched and weary. She had lost her way in the hills. The lantern, lifted high, caught her eye as she stumbled into the square. He held it steady. "I've been waiting," he whispered, though it was neither boast nor complaint, merely acknowledgement of the way light can call us home. She laughed softly, tears mingling with rain. "Always," she said, "you always bring the way." And it was true. Not through power or urgency, but through small, steady light he offered a path. Years later he understood that storms were less about destruction and more about perspective. The lightning revealed branches hidden in shadow. The wind tested the strength of structures. The rain carved new patterns in the soil. He began to see storms as teachers, and the lantern as the instrument through which he learned patience, courage, and the quiet power of being present. There came nights when the storm was inner rather than outer, when grief, loneliness, or uncertainty raged like wind and rain inside his chest. Then the lantern became metaphor as much as tool. He placed it before him, letting its warmth spread to his hands, his face, his heart. And slowly, as he breathed with it, the tempest within loosened. He realized that presence, his own, attentive and kind, could illuminate even the darkest recess of the mind. And perhaps that was the most important lesson the lantern offered. In old age, he no longer needed to climb hills or face raging seas. He would lift the lantern and watch from the window, letting its glow mingle with the storm's final breath. The village, now wiser in the ways of light, would leave windows and doorways open, little flames reflecting in puddles, tiny points of safety for those still learning to navigate the night. The storm remained fierce, but he no longer feared it. The lantern, small and steadfast, had taught him that storms are part of life. But so too is the gentle act of shining. One small light, one careful step, one hand extended. And when he finally rested at the end of the day, the storm outside or within no longer pressing, he whispered, "Even in darkness, even in rain, even in fear, there is a way. And if you can carry even a little light, it will guide you home." The lantern flickered softly, as if agreeing. before settling into a calm glow that carried the night with it. Memory is a loom, and life, a tapestry that grows thread by thread. Some strands are vivid, colored like sunsets or ripe fruit. Others are pale, whispered into existence, fading yet never gone. He had spent his years gathering threads, observing how each one interwove with the others, creating patterns he only began to understand in quiet moments. It began in childhood, of course, though he did not recognize it as weaving then. A lullaby hummed by his mother, a gentle scolding from a mentor, laughter shared with his sister beneath the stars, all tiny filaments of a growing tapestry. Each was a thread that would never leave him, even if he forgot its source. He learned to notice these strands, to pull them gently from the recesses of mind and let them mingle. Sometimes the weaving was bright and joyful, sometimes dark, shaded with sorrow. But every piece mattered. Even the threads that prick or tangle shaped the fabric of the whole. As he grew, the threads multiplied. The garden at dusk, the voice of clouds, the ocean's embrace, lanterns in storms, all wove into one larger pattern. They were motifs in the tapestry of his life, reminders that small acts and quiet observations accumulate into meaning. He began to recognize recurring shapes, kindness emerging from hardship, laughter woven into sorrow, love threading subtly through loss. Even moments of solitude became deliberate stitches, spaces for reflection, gaps that allowed the tapestry to breathe. One afternoon, he sat by the window of the old house, a skein of yarn and a small loom in front of him. Though he did not intend to craft anything ordinary, instead, he gathered memory itself, touching each thread lightly with thought. He remembered the first sandwich eaten beneath the stars, the feel of salt water wrapping around his ankles, the hum of clouds as he lay in fields watching them drift. Each memory shimmered like silk, delicate but resilient. He traced them in his mind, and in doing so they began to connect. He saw the laughter of his sister beside the hill of stars and the quiet guidance of his mentor in the garden. He saw travelers led safely through storms by lanterns he carried. Each memory a thread stretched across his life, and somehow they all touched each other, forming a net of continuity and comfort. Sometimes threads frayed. Moments once bright dulled with time. Faces of friends faded, voices dimmed. He did not resist. Instead, he treated them like old threads that needed gentle care. He brushed dust from the colors, smoothed tangles, and let them settle back into place. He discovered that even frayed threads added texture. They deepened the tapestry, added shadow and contrast, and taught him that imperfection was part of beauty. One evening, as twilight softened the sky, he invited his sister to sit with him. She watched as he traced the invisible loom of his memory, fingers hovering over air. "Do you see it all?" she asked softly. He shook his head, smiling. "Not all. But enough. Enough to understand that nothing was wasted. Every laugh, every tear, every meal, every storm, woven together, they form something enduring." She nodded, placing a hand lightly over his. "Even absence?" "Especially absence," he replied. "It is the space that makes the threads visible, gives them meaning." They remained in quiet reflection, letting the loom hum in their thoughts, weaving without words. As years passed, he began to notice patterns forming not only in his own life, but in others. Travelers who came to the garden, the hill, the ocean, each carried threads that intertwined subtly with his. Conversations, shared meals, small acts of kindness, they became part of the same grand tapestry. He realized that memory is not contained solely within one mind. It travels, crosses into others, touches lives quietly and without fanfare. A smile exchanged, a hand offered, a gentle word. These threads extend far beyond the loom he could see, stretching into spaces he would never witness. There were moments when the loom seemed impossible to manage, threads tangling in endless knots. Grief pressed heavy. Regrets whispered insistently. Yet even then he found solace in the act of weaving itself. To recognize a memory, to place it deliberately within the pattern, was an act of care, of presence. He understood that it was not necessary for every thread to be perfect, nor every design coherent. What mattered was acknowledgement. What mattered was attention. One afternoon he walked to the garden, carrying a small basket of yarn alongside a few sprigs of sage. He sat beneath the trees, breathing the air rich with earth and fragrance. He laid out the threads before him, each one representing a day, a conversation, a quiet act he had witnessed or participated in. He worked slowly, knotting, looping, tracing, letting the motions guide him. Each pass of the fingers across the threads reminded him of the gentle acts that stitched life together. A child learning patience, a traveler finding warmth, a friend listening without judgment. By sunset, the pattern was visible, not in color or shape, but in resonance. It hummed softly, echoing the rhythm of the garden, the song of clouds, the pulse of the ocean, the lanterns in storms. Memory, he realized, is alive. It does not merely record. It teaches, comforts, and extends beyond the self. As twilight deepened, he thought of all those who would inherit the tapestry in subtle ways. The small acts they would repeat, the lessons they would carry forward, the memories they would weave into their own lives. Even in absence, the threads persisted. He whispered into the dusk, "Each memory, small or grand, is a light, and even when I am gone, the tapestry remains. It holds everything, and it stretches across those who come after." The loom never forgets. That night he placed the basket of yarn on the porch, letting the threads drift slightly in the breeze. The air seemed to acknowledge them, carrying a faint hum as if the loom itself were breathing. He sat leaning back, feeling the cumulative warmth of all the threads he had woven, and in the quiet he understood something profound. Life is less about accumulation and more about weaving. Each day, each act, each presence is a thread. And when observed, acknowledged, and cherished, even the most fragile strands gain permanence. The weaving of memory, he realized, is love in its quietest, most enduring form. There comes a moment in every life when the old songs rise one final time. They are not heard in the ears alone, but in the chest, in the quiet spaces where memory and longing meet. He first sensed the presence of the old gods in whispers, the tremble of a leaf, the hush of the wind across the hills, the soft glow of twilight that seemed too deliberate to be accidental. The gods did not appear in thunder or fire. They appeared as subtle notes, delicate as smoke, weaving through moments he had long considered ordinary. A bird's cry at dawn, a ripple across a pond, a sudden fragrance that reminded him of home. He understood gradually that their song was not meant to startle. It was meant to awaken something forgotten, the reverence for small wonders, the attention to quiet miracles, the recognition that all things are fleeting yet eternal in their resonance. In childhood, he had imagined them as towering figures, commanding and wise, but the reality was softer, more profound. They were patience, kindness, insight. They were the way clouds drift, the way oceans embrace, the way lanterns illuminate the night. The old gods did not need followers. They only needed witnesses. And he had become one. He remembered standing on the hill one evening, the sky awash of violet and gold, listening to the voice of clouds. The melody had shifted that day, subtly, enriched by layers he could not name. It was as if the old gods themselves had joined the hum, threading it into eternity. He closed his eyes and let himself be carried by the sound. His heart swelled with recognition. These were not tales of conquest or displays of power. These were songs of presence, of watching, of caring without expectation. The gods' final song was not sudden. It began as small harmonies, barely perceived, growing richer with every evening. He felt it in the sway of grass, the whisper of the wind, the cadence of waves. It threaded through memory, linking the sandwiches beneath stars, the lanterns in storms, the embrace of the ocean. It was everywhere, and yet nowhere. He felt it less as sound and more as a pulse, the rhythm of the world itself breathing softly. One twilight, as the first stars began to punctuate the deepening sky, he sensed the song crystallize. He sat at the garden's edge, leaning on his staff, listening. The song was neither sorrowful nor jubilant. It was complete. So it carried the weight of all that had been lived, all that had been lost, all that had been loved. And in it he recognized a profound truth. The gods' final song was not an ending, but a testament. A promise that everything, each memory, each act of kindness, each moment of wonder, would endure in resonance, however faint. It reminded him of the countless quiet acts of the world that went unnoticed. The soft kindness of a friend, the patience of a teacher, the laughter of a child carried on the wind. The old god's song intertwined with these threads, acknowledging the ordinary as sacred. He hummed softly along, adding his own note to the chorus. It was not hubris. It was participation. The song invited all who had seen, heard, and felt to contribute their fragment. And he, small among eternity, joined gladly. Memories surfaced as he listened. He remembered the hill with sandwiches and stars, the ocean's endless embrace, lanterns guiding travelers, clouds teaching patience. He saw his sister's laughter, felt the warmth of mentors' hands, recalled travelers' gratitude. Each memory formed a note, a string, a pulse in the grand symphony of the final song. It was as if every life he had touched, or that had touched him, converged in this moment. The tapestry of experience resonated, and the song grew, embracing every thread with gentle certainty. The god's song did not end with spectacle. There were no great lights or sweeping manifestations, only understanding. Only the knowledge that time, loss, joy, and love could coexist in harmony, and in its subtlety, it was overwhelming. He understood then why the gods had remained hidden, why their presence was so quiet. They were not here to dominate, to demand, or to inspire fear. They were here to remind, to witness, to ensure that the ordinary, if observed with care, becomes sacred. He breathed deeply, feeling the song in his chest, in his arms, in the tips of his fingers resting lightly on the earth. It resonated with the rhythm of his own heartbeat, a quiet affirmation that life, flickering, transient, fragile, was miraculous simply for existing. A soft wind swept through the garden, carrying the melody across the hills. It brushed his cheek like a whisper, nudging memories awake, threading them into the eternal chorus. He realized the song was leaving, not disappearing, but folding into everything that remained. The stars, the clouds, the waves, the trees, the air itself. And in that folding, he understood something profound. Endings are not final. They transform, persisting in echo, in memory, in the quiet places of being. He rose slowly, hands pressed together, eyes lifting to the horizon. The last notes lingered like a mist, soft and golden, wrapping him in warmth. He hummed along, one last addition, a thread to the song of all that had been. When the light faded from the sky and the first evening star appeared, he whispered, "Thank you, for being, for seeing, for listening." The garden was silent, yet alive. He felt the gods in the sway of branches, in the pulse of the soil, in the breath of the air. They had sung, and now their song was everywhere. He walked slowly toward the hill of stars, carrying nothing but presence and memory. Along the way, he traced the lanterns left behind in storms, the ripples in the ocean's edge, the traces of sandwiches eaten beneath constellations. Each was a refrain, a soft echo of the god's song, and as he reached the top, he looked across the horizon, heart full of gratitude, mind empty of fear. The song had ended, yet it persisted, in the air, in the stars, in the subtle movements of life. He hummed once more, faintly, tenderly, before sitting to watch the first night fully unfold. The last song of the old gods was not a crescendo or finale. It was an embrace. It was patience. It was quiet, enduring, infinite. And in its gentle exhale he understood that everything, memory, love, presence, and even absence, was part of a grand harmony, one that would continue long after he was gone. He closed his eyes, feeling the pulse of the world, letting the quiet carry him towards sleep. And somewhere, in the soft spaces between stars and shadows, the old gods listened still. There are goodbyes that scream, that fracture, that demand acknowledgement through tears and shouts. And then there are goodbyes like whispers, quiet and unassuming yet heavy with meaning. He had learned over the years that the gentlest goodbyes carry the most weight, not because they seek attention, but because they linger softly in memory, unhurried and enduring. It began with small things, a nod of recognition when a friend left the garden, a soft wave as a traveler departed the hill of stars, a lingering glance at the ocean before turning home. Each farewell was a quiet threading, like the closing of a book whose pages still resonate after the cover is shut. Even in his own life, he understood that departures need not be dramatic. Presence, care, attention, these were the truest offerings, and in their absence, memory would hold them steady. One evening, as twilight brushed the edges of the sky with purple and gold, he found himself walking to the hill alone. The lanterns from storms past flickered faintly in the wind, and the stars above blinked softly, attentive and patient. He carried no bundle, no ritual, no plan, only his own quiet awareness. He felt a presence in the air, a subtle acknowledgement of all that had passed. Friends, mentors, siblings, travelers, all lives he had touched and who had touched him, seemed to hover in the spaces between shadows. And he realized, the gentle goodbye was not about leaving. It was about honoring the threads, acknowledging the weave of connection, and offering release without resistance. He remembered the first goodbye that had shaped him, unremarkable in its immediacy, yet monumental in retrospect. His mentor had passed, leaving only words whispered on the wind. Carry light, see the unseen, be steady in presence. No great ceremonies, no fanfare, only a soft exhale of instruction that remained in him, a seed growing slowly through decades. From that farewell he learned that absence could be tender, that endings could be luminous even without sound, that memory could be a bridge rather than a chasm. Now, as he reached the crest of the hill, he paused. The wind stirred lightly, brushing the hair from his face. The stars above shimmered, constellations familiar yet infinitely new. He breathed in the night, feeling the rhythm of the world, and let himself reflect on all the gentle goodbyes he had offered and received. Each one was a pattern in the grand tapestry of life, a stitch that might seem small but whose resonance could stretch across time. And in understanding this, he found comfort. Every farewell, when given fully and softly, left the world a little brighter, a little lighter. A traveler appeared, arriving silently, soaking from the evening's drizzle. The lantern he carried flickered weakly, almost faltering in the wind. The traveler's eyes met his, unspoken recognition passing between them. "You've walked here often, haven't you?" the traveler asked, voice low. He nodded. "Many times, and each time I've left something behind, and taken something as well." The traveler smiled. "And it remains?" "It does," he replied. "In memory, in story, in presence. It never truly leaves. That is the gentle goodbye." They walked together for a short distance, stepping carefully over grass and stones, sharing neither words nor silence as burdens, but as companions. And in that shared passage, the act of farewell became luminous, an acknowledgement that departures are not endings, but continuations in another form. The night deepened, and the stars leaned closer, as if to witness. He found himself thinking of all the threads he had woven, sandwiches and stars, the ocean's embrace, lanterns in storms, clouds speaking softly, memories threading into a tapestry. Each moment now carried the weight of farewell, of transition, of recognition, and yet it did not depress him. There was joy in letting go. There was peace in acceptance. There was gratitude in knowing that even as people and places change, the resonance of care remains. He paused at the hill's edge, the wind carrying the scent of earth and distant flowers. He raised a hand to the sky, as though greeting the invisible audience of his life's quiet acts. "Thank you," he whispered, not to anyone in particular, but to everyone, to those who had arrived, to those who had departed, to those who would continue the journey. Each goodbye had been a note, and together they composed a gentle symphony, subtle yet infinite. The traveler watched him, understanding without words. Sometimes goodbyes need no explanation. They only need presence, only need recognition, only need a hand extended in quiet affirmation. As the hours passed, he sat, letting the wind and stars carry his thoughts. He recalled friends who had gone, lovers who had parted, mentors who had vanished. And he noticed something profound. The soft echoes of their presence lingered in small, unassuming ways, the scent of a flower, the shimmer of a wave, the hush of clouds. Absence, he realized, was not emptiness. It was a different form of closeness. A gentle goodbye does not leave voids. It leaves space to remember, to cherish, to continue. When he finally rose, he carried nothing with him. No lantern, no bundle, no list of instructions. Only the memory of the gentle goodbyes he had offered. And received, a warmth radiating quietly from chest to fingertips. He walked down the hill slowly, stepping softly, aware that each movement was a thread woven into the night. At the garden's edge, he paused once more, feeling the familiar pulse of the world. The old songs lingered faintly, the tapestry of memory stretched behind him, and he understood that every act of care, every moment of attentiveness, every gentle farewell was a gift to those who remain. He exhaled softly, a final deliberate sigh. It was neither sorrow nor joy, but something richer, acknowledgement, gratitude, and peace. In the quiet of the night, he whispered again, gently, to all who might listen. Goodbye is not leaving. It is seeing, it is honoring, it is holding lightly and letting softly, and in that all is well. The stars above shimmered in agreement. The wind carried his words across fields, oceans, hills, and hearts, and somewhere the echoes of gentle goodbyes joined with the soft refrain of memory, presence, and love. He smiled, feeling the weight of years settle into softness, and walked home with quiet steps, knowing that life's farewells could be luminous, tender, and enduring. There comes a moment when the world softens in ways impossible to describe. Time seems to stretch, the air itself holding its breath, and every sound, every whisper, every rustle, every heartbeat carries a gentle weight. He had walked toward this moment his entire life, though he did not know it. The journey had been neither hurried nor loud, only steady, marked by quiet acts, remembered threads, and lanterns lifted against storms. And now, the final chapter waited, not with urgency, but with open arms. He found himself at the Hill of Stars once more, the ground familiar beneath his feet. The lanterns from storms past swayed lightly in the breeze, casting tender glows on grass and stones. The ocean murmured softly in the distance, and the clouds drifted like hushed witnesses. It felt less like an ending and more like a settling, a final alignment of everything that had come before. He breathed in the night, letting it fill him completely. In that breath he felt the presence of all he had known, the laughter of a sister, the guidance of mentors, the travelers led safely by his hand, the subtle songs of the old gods, and he realized that all of it had converged here. The eternal rest was not a place. It was a state, a gentle unfolding, a recognition that the threads he had woven through life did not vanish but extended infinitely. Each memory, each act of care, each song and whisper persisted in resonance. It was as if the universe itself exhaled, acknowledging every moment of presence he had offered. He sat leaning on the hill, watching the stars shimmer. They were neither bright nor dim. They were simply perfectly themselves. And in them he saw reflections of everything he had loved, everything he had learned, everything he had allowed himself to feel. The wind rose slightly, carrying scents of earth and salt, of flowers and rain, of fires long extinguished yet never forgotten. It moved through him like a soft current, and he understood that the eternal rest required nothing from him. It demanded no proof, no triumph, no loud declaration. It asked only for acknowledgement, for gentle acceptance, for the quiet closing of eyes that had seen much and loved fully. He closed his own eyes, feeling the world settle around him. And in that stillness, memories began to flow unbidden, not chaotic, but like a gentle river tracing its own channels, carrying him without resistance. He remembered the sandwiches beneath stars, shared with a sister whose laughter still lingered. He remembered the ocean's embrace, wrapping him in calm when storms threatened. He remembered lanterns lifted in storms, clouds speaking softly, the gentle guidance of those who had taught him without demanding. He remembered the tapestry of memory, each thread glowing in his mind with quiet light, all of it converged in a soft exhale, a single note in the endless song of life, and he let himself drift into it fully. In his final moments, he felt the presence of the old gods, not as towering figures or beings of power, but as the very essence of attention, of presence, of care. Their song hummed beneath his chest, soft and persistent, threading through every memory, every act, every life he had touched. And he realized that he too had contributed to the song, a small note joining the eternal chorus. He smiled, a slow, deep curve of lips that spoke of gratitude and understanding. There was no fear, no regret, only recognition. Life had been lived fully, quietly, and tenderly. Every storm had passed. Every farewell had left light. Every memory had been woven into the grand tapestry. He felt the subtle pull of sleep, not the urgent collapse of exhaustion, but a gentle invitation, a whisper of release. It was the final journey, the resting place beyond all movement, beyond all expectation. He surrendered to it willingly, letting the threads of presence, memory, and love carry him, as if lifted on invisible arms. The hill beneath him became soft. The stars above seemed to lean closer. The wind softened to a hush. Even the ocean's waves slowed their rhythm, cradling him in a lullaby that stretched across time and space. And in that moment, he understood that the eternal rest was not absence. It was continuity. It was the recognition that every life, every act, every thought of kindness, every small gesture of presence endures in unseen ways. It is carried forward not in noise or monument, but in subtle resonance, the laughter of those who remember, the warmth of those touched, the quiet hum of the world itself. He breathed in slowly, deeply, allowing every part of himself to become one with the stillness. And as he exhaled, he felt the gentle weaving of his life merge seamlessly with the tapestry of all existence. Nothing was lost. Everything remained in threads, in echoes, in quiet light. In the final heartbeat, he sent a soft thought outward, a gift to anyone who might hear, anyone who might need it. Thank you for seeing. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being present in this quiet, luminous life. And now let us rest together softly, gently, endlessly. The stars blinked as if in agreement. The wind whispered in reply. Somewhere the ocean hummed. Somewhere the old god's final song lingered. And somewhere he was carried fully into the eternal rest, neither alone nor hurried, merely present, merely acknowledged, wholly at peace. And somewhere he is still out there, walking the hills, lifting lanterns, listening to clouds, sharing sandwiches beneath stars, letting the tapestry of memory ripple softly through the universe. And in the hush of night, he stretched softly into the stars, leaving behind only warmth and quiet wonder. Thank you for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, my friend.